Alice woke up slowly. What's going on? Her mind raced. There was something hard against her back, and panic immediately made her heart race. Maybe this is still a dream, Alice thought, trying to remember what had happened before she came to her senses. And the new girl seemed to have woken up. Came the gruff voice of a woman in the distance. And you say dead? No. It's just a dream, Alice reassured herself. Just a nightmare that's about to dissipate, but the smells, the sounds that entered her nostrils and ears were too real for a nightmare. And I wonder where she was brought to us from. Came the voice again. Did a cutie like that manage to finish someone off? The voices were rough and unpleasant. Alice struggled to open her eyes and realized she was in a dingy cell. Not at a resort, said a woman, sitting not far from Alice. Several gray-clad prisoners were sitting next to her, and the stare seemed no good. Alice felt fear engulf her entire being. She desperately didn't understand how she had ended up in this casemate. What are you looking at? One of the sitters threw angrily. Alice immediately jumped up, huddled in a corner, and tucked her legs under her. Her heart was racing, her eyes filled with terror. The people in the cell were clearly repeat offenders, with the marks of a hard life on their faces, and the fingers of their hands were littered with various tattoos. Oh, she's going to faint from fear again, one of the sitters grinned. I'm Barbara, muttered the recidivist sitting closest to Alice the Watcher. What's your name? Still dazed, Alice couldn't understand what was happening. Just yesterday she had been in the arms of her husband Daniel on one of Sunny Beach's beaches. Memories came to her like a flashed frame from a movie. Do you remember when we first met? Daniel asked then, smiling. Well, how could anyone forget that? You took me away from my own birthday party and drove me around town all night until it was time to meet the sunrise. Alice smiled. Their whole relationship had been just magical, unbelievable, like an adventure. But now the fairy tale had turned into a nightmare. Alice dreaded every minute spent in that gloomy cell. She was uncomfortable. She couldn't understand how she'd even ended up in this situation in the first place. Did you swallow your tongue? Barbara muttered angrily. The woman got up from her bunk, walked over to Alice, and leaned over her threateningly. Talk about sewing someone up, Barbara hissed. Maybe you're too cool to talk to us. And my dear must have just forgotten her tongue on the outside, exclaimed the other. The unpleasant laughter and derogatory remarks of the cellmates made Alice feel even more afraid and helpless. She could feel the despair coursing through her soul. There were tears in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back, afraid to show her weakness. So what did you get raked up for? Barbara muttered. Tell me before you're driven under the bunkhouse. I'm sorry, Alice mumbled, then still tried to explain. I don't understand. Maybe you drank too much champagne at your fancy party, one of Barbara's companions hissed angrily. She stood up, picked up a mug from the table, and splashed Alice in the face with cold water. Alice shuddered, feeling the moisture spreading through her clothes. For what? What have I done? The desperation in her voice was growing with each passing second. Finally, Alice couldn't take it anymore and jumped up from her seat straight to the door. Beginning to pound on the steel-battered barrier, she screamed. Somebody open up! Alice pounded her fists on the cold surface. Suddenly, the small window in the center opened again, and the sleepy face of a guard appeared in the opening. What do you want? Scared, he asked gruffly. Call the supervisor. I need to talk to him. There's some kind of mistake. I'm not supposed to be here, Alice yelled. Girl, you're in the wrong place to ask to see someone. Wait until morning. Maybe you'll get an explanation. Then the guard tossed indifferently. Please, this is important. I need to get to the bottom of this situation. Call the supervisor. Please, Alice continued to plead with hope in her voice. The man only shook his head, maintaining a look of indifference on his face. No one's going to make a request in the middle of the night for someone like you, the policeman muttered. Frankly, if I were you, I wouldn't count on any response during the day either. Alice took a step back, clasping her hands to her chest. Feeling helpless inside, she was forced to accept the rejection. The metal flap slammed shut. The lock clinked. Sitting back in her seat, Alice felt the icy claws of fear clutching her heart. At no time in her life had she ever felt as insignificant as she did now. Alice tried to calm herself, but the fear and bewilderment would not leave her. She did not know how she had ended up in prison. Alice felt completely disconnected from reality. Barbara, who had taunted her earlier, came over and asked, Are you really that stupid? Or are you just pretending to be? No, I don't remember anything. I don't even know what date today is, Alice replied with despair in her voice. July 18th, Barbara said with bewilderment. Alice felt a pang in her chest. It had been almost 2 days since she'd been in this nightmarish reality, and that knowledge only added to her sense of despair. Who are you anyway? Softening her voice, Barbara inquired. It seems like just yesterday I married Daniel. We had a wedding on the beach. It was so beautiful, and today I wake up in this prison, Alice began to say. Is that all you have to say? Barbara raised an eyebrow skeptically. My dad died recently, and he left me a pretty good inheritance. But that doesn't explain anything. I've been happy. We were doing well in my marriage to Daniel. Alice shook her head. Memories of her father made her soul feel sad. I guess they said you killed someone, Barbara replied in a lowered voice. What kind of nonsense is that? Who could I have killed? Alice sighed sorrowfully. She felt an inner shock and panic. This realization terrified her, and she still couldn't believe the reality of what was happening. It didn't take long for morning to come. The scowling guard opened his window again, found Alice's gaze, and beckoned her over. You're being summoned, he muttered when he saw the girl come to the door. Warden, Alice asked hopefully. She interjected. Face the wall, the guard swung the door open, pushed her against the nearest wall, turned her around, and clasped her hands painfully. Let go, Alice exclaimed with desperation in her voice. She felt the cold bracelets click on her wrist. The guard roughly took her under the elbow and pushed her out into the hallway. Good morning, sweetheart. A man in an investigator's uniform smiled unpleasantly. My name's John, the first I'm investigating your case, but I wouldn't say I'm glad to meet you, Alice snorted. Her handcuffs were never removed, and Alice was forced to sit on the very edge of the uncomfortable chair. Well, I'm sure you'll get used to our conditions, John smiled unpleasantly again. Although perhaps you're ready to confess to your stepfather's death now. After all, you were the one who killed him. What stepfather? My father died recently. Who do you think I am? Alice exclaimed in bewilderment. Well, honey, you don't have to pretend like you don't know. Your fingerprints are at the crime scene, and your DNA evidence confirms your involvement. John tossed some opinion sheets onto the table, pointing to them with his hand in an inviting gesture. Alice rounded her eyes in horror. Her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. What fingerprints? What does DNA have to do with it? A panicked thought battered at the back of her mind. That's impossible. I didn't kill anyone. I don't even know what crime we're talking about, Alice whispered. Of course you do, of course you do. We've got a whole lot of innocent people here, John nodded. What's this then? The investigator dug through the folder again, then showed Alice the crime scene photos. Some man was lying face down, with blood all around him and shrapnel lying on the floor near his body. What does this man have to do with this? Alice asked in a trembling voice. She could feel the ground slipping from under her feet, and the worry was weighing so heavily on her soul that it was about to tear her apart. That's your business, John marveled. I might as well be. But here the neighbors have absolutely pinpointed the culprit, and even made a sketch. The investigator pointed with his hand to a booth hanging to Alice's right. She turned and stared at her own image. The girl in the sketch looked exactly like her, except the first and last name were different. This is some kind of forgery. It can't be me. Alice felt everything inside her turn over with horror. This sketch was proof that she had something to do with the mysterious crime. Sweetheart, we found you on the seashore. You were lying there unconscious and had no identification on you. Your sketch matched the description given by the witnesses. Therefore, you are now a murder suspect, John said, savoring every word. So that's not my last name. I'm a completely different person. Go to my husband. He will tell you, Alice cried out in despair. We haven't seen any husband yet, he muttered doubtfully. We have, however, discovered a man's belongings on the shore. I suppose your spouse, if there was one, is in distress, either drowned himself or another victim of your criminal tendencies. Alice felt her whole body go numb. She couldn't believe Daniel could have gotten into danger. Ask someone else. My co-workers at work, relatives. But someone has to tell you what my real name is, and you'll even give those people's contacts yourself, she said. John raised an eyebrow skeptically. Yes, now. Alice, finding herself in a serious situation, began to frantically search her memory, trying to recall anyone who could confirm her identity and dispel any doubts that she was innocent. John watched her the whole time, enjoying the desperation of the suspect, but after a couple minutes he was clearly bored with the spectacle. "Remember?" the investigator inquired in a jumped-up tone. "Just a minute." "You don't have a minute," John bellowed. He leaned across the table, grabbed Alice by the hair and yanked hard, making her head whip from side to side. "Quickly sign the confession. Get to the bunkhouse. I'm not going to be dealing with crap all day." Tears spurted from Alice's eyes. She cried out painfully, feeling the pain pierce her head and travel down her spine. The investigator continued to yell something and threaten, but now his voice sounded as if from far away. "Helen, my subordinate at my father's firm," Alice said through sobs. "What?" John interjected angrily. "Helen Savage. She'll confirm that she knows me." "The phone or something?" Not understanding, John interjected. "Phone dictate." Stupid, the investigator let go of his hair. Alice sobbed a couple more times, then began confusedly dictating the right numbers. "I'll call her." "But if this is some kind of joke, you're going to be very sorry," John muttered angrily. Alice stared at the floor in pain and fear. The mind abstracted, preferring to ignore reality. Her gaze froze. After all, she wasn't capable of experiencing so much stress in such a short time, was she? Understand? "No," John bellowed, giving Alice a whipping slap. "Got it," Alice barely audibly whispered, feeling the blood begin to ooze from her busted lip. Several hours passed, which she spent like this in the investigator's office. "Excuse me, Mr. Investigator. There's someone here to see you," came the voice of a guard from behind the door. "What's going on here?" the blonde shouted indignantly, throwing a lightning-fast glare in the investigator's direction as she barely crossed the threshold of his office. "Ah, a friend of the suspect. I guess." John shook his head indifferently. "Yes, I've known Alice for a long time, and I have every confidence in her innocence. She is the daughter of my boss. And at the time this crime is alleged to have been committed, she was in a completely different location. We have witnesses, documents to prove her alibi," Helen spoke coldly. "And we have proof," John parried stiffly. "This is some kind of setup. Alice is innocent of anything, and no amount of fingerprints will help you wrangle 50 people who saw her in person at the negotiations on the day of the alleged murder." Alice listened to Helen and John's conversation with mixed feelings of anxiety and hope. At first, she had felt horror and anxiety as she listened to the investigator insist on her guilt and present the evidence. But with Helen's arrival and her confident words of innocence, hope rang within. "I'm asking you to leave Alice alone," Helen said peremptorily. "Otherwise, we'll have to get the press involved." "No press," John retorted sourly. It seemed he had to admit that they simply didn't have enough grounds to accuse Alice. "I'm sorry, I think there's been a mix-up," John said reluctantly. Turning to Alice, "You may not be the only child in your family. There is a possibility that you had a twin sister." "What twins?" Alice interjected bitterly. "But if you have any other ways to explain the devilishness going on in this case, I'm listening," the man muttered unhappily. A storm of feelings erupted inside Alice. She couldn't understand what this was about or why there was suddenly information about twins. She felt her life falling apart and the footing going out from under her feet. Mixed feelings, confusion, bewilderment, fear overwhelmed her. She realized that she needed to solve this puzzle to understand what was even going on in her life. Helen insisted that Alice be released immediately. "Helen, do you know what happened to Daniel?" Alice asked first thing. "No one has seen him for the last few days," the assistant shrugged. "Everyone thought you were on vacation after the wedding." The car began to pull away from the gloomy building, and anxiety grew more and more pronounced in Alice's heart. "Are you sure you can manage?" Helen asked doubtfully, looking at her superior. "Yes. Don't worry," Alice dismissed absent-mindedly. All her thoughts were now focused on the search. She ran into the house, literally flew up the second floor to her in her husband's bedroom, and embraced the sight. But there was only emptiness. "Where could you have disappeared to?" Alice muttered fearfully, looking through Daniel's things. Dialing a familiar number with trembling fingers, she put the phone to her ear, listening to the dial tone with bated breath. Come on," she whispered. It was all to no avail. The phone was silent, as was the empty bedroom, which was unable to clear up the monstrous situation one bit. Alice remembered again how they had planned to spend a romantic vacation on the beach. "Trust me, it's going to be awesome," Daniel said with a smile, showing her pictures of golden sand and azure sea. "We'll be all alone there," Alice said hesitantly, as if sensing trouble. "Well, that's just the opposite of great. Just imagine you, me, the sea, and no one else around. Isn't it a fairy tale?" A fairy tale. And if Alice had known how this ill-fated trip would turn out, she would never have agreed to this godforsaken place. "Hello, Bill, this is Daniel's wife. Hi, do you have any idea where Daniel might be right now?" she said, dialing the number of a fellow spouse they had met at the wedding. "Hi, I thought he was on a wedding trip with you," Bill replied doubtfully. "And we just missed each other." "Sorry to bother you," Alice said. "Is something wrong? Do you need help?" Bill muttered worriedly. "No, sorry, bye." Alice hung up the phone. Her inner feelings were at breaking point. Just out of desperation, Alice opened the message list on her phone, her eyes stumbling upon a text message from the DHS informing her that a major storm was coming. A chilling realization ran through her body. The words that had come almost a week ago never left her. A violent storm. The danger the meteorologists had warned of. Right, how could I have forgotten about the storm they'd had to postpone the trip? But Daniel had insisted that no forecast of bad weather could interfere with their love. "Okay, I hope you're right," Alice said. Romance and carelessness mixed with champagne that day, and she did nothing to stop her husband. How could I forget that the meteorologists were predicting a major storm that day? We couldn't only give warning. It was our mistake, but reflection and self-deprecation brought no comfort. It was my fault. I should have convinced Daniel not to go ashore, and I remained silent. And now he's probably drowned because of me. Alice's voice trembled with guilt and hopelessness. She tried to hold back the tears, but still they rolled down her cheeks, leaving hot paths behind them. Her breath caught at the thought that she would never see Daniel again, that he might have died because of her own carelessness. "Daniel." "I'm sorry." Alice closed her eyes, trying to dull the pain, but she could feel the guilt pressing on her shoulders like a heavy weight that she must now carry alone. Alice grieved for a few days, but then determination and the desire to find out the truth took over. "I can't sit here in despair any longer," Alice exclaimed, feeling the walls of the empty bedroom literally suffocating her. "Daniel deserves for the truth to come out. I have to find out what happened that day." That being said, it was done. She began contacting people who could help her in this endeavor. One of them was Victor Palick, her late father's former partner. "Alice, I understand you. Losing loved ones is very painful," he said with compassion. "I've known you since you were in diapers, and I'm always ready to help. I have an acquaintance named Andrew. I think he can help with this case." "He'd want to work for me," Alice said doubtfully. "You see, he's got an expensive operation coming up that he doesn't have enough money for. If you're willing to pay well, the guy will get you the very devil out of the ground. Trust me, he's the best detective I know." "Yeah, I'm willing. It's a small price to pay for the truth." Alice shook her head. "That's good." She clasped her hands to her chest. Feeling mixed emotions inside, Alice was willing to go to any lengths to find answers, even if it did require her to spend an unexpected amount of money. She met Andrew at a small cafe in the center of town. Alice gave him all the information she had on Daniel, directing him to search for him. But she decided to start on the other side, to find traces of her doppelganger. It remained to discuss a plan of action, which they did at a neat coffee shop table. "I understand the mission. We'll try to find Daniel, or at least find out what happened to him. But what do you need this doppelganger for?" Andrew asked, perplexed. "The investigator just decided to write off an unsolved case on you, so he made up a fairy tale. Is it worth your time? I think if I find it might shed some light on the whole story. Maybe she knows something or has something to do with what happened. We need to find out why I was mistaken for her, and how it's simultaneously connected to Daniel's disappearance," Alice reasoned. "Yeah, maybe there's no doppelganger at all." "What makes you think that's true?" Andrew said. "It's just, it's like a gut feeling that there's a string to pull, and it all happened in the same period of time." Alice's eyes read determination to find out everything, and either find Daniel or mourn his ashes. Andrew nodded, realizing that was the logical course of action. Okay, let's start by looking for traces of your doppelganger. Perhaps her friends, co-workers, or even family can help. I'll work on that for now, while you continue your own search. And if you find anything, let me know. I think we can solve this mystery together. There's no need to despair before the time. Thank you, Alice whispered softly. Andrew's reassurance gave her strength, helped her shake off her troubles. Alice arrived in the quiet suburban neighborhood where her copy was said to be living with her stepfather. What a shithole, Alice muttered, deciding not to waste any time. She headed straight for the house, feeling a mixed sense of anxiety and determination. Finally, gone somewhere, the wretch. Left me and the kids and went away. And you didn't even tell us when you'd be back, the burly aunt blurted out as she stepped out into the stairwell. I'm sorry, you have me confused. I'm not who you thought I was, Alice said doubtfully. Shameless. Forgetting about your brood and driving off somewhere. So irresponsible, echoed the gaunt man. Alice tried to explain to them that they were wrong. It seemed the neighbors had mistaken her for a double. Wait a minute, I'm not Anna. You've got me confused. What are you talking about? Wailed the little man. Wait, yanked him back doubtfully by his aunt. There's something wrong. She's kind of frumpy, not at all like our catty. Exactly. And her features are softer and her eyes look different, the man muttered, immediately replacing anger with curiosity. My name is Greg, and this is my wife Irene, excuse me, but who is Katie and where is she now? Alice interjected. And she went away a long time ago. Left us with the kids. Didn't say when she'd be back. And didn't tell me anything at all, Greg grumbled resentfully. Yeah, you two seem to be a lot alike, like sisters. Katie lived here with her mom until she died. Her stepfather drank and abused her from childhood, Irene said in a lowered voice. And then he was found dead with a knife in his back. They suspect Katie killed him and ran away. I warned him not to torture a girl so much. Alice listened to the neighbors, feeling mixed emotions. She realized that she had a very mysterious story to tell, and she wanted to know more. The tale shocked her. It's unbelievable. I couldn't even imagine that I could have a sister. So where is she now? In a trembling voice, Alice asked again. Oh, we don't know, Irene shrugged. She was missing when the incident happened. The kids, 3 of them you can imagine, were put in an orphanage. Looking at her neighbor, Alice felt the bitter pain and simultaneous joy of knowing she might have a family, new relatives. Wow, Alice thought to herself. She sat in the car, staring at the orphanage where she was headed to see her nephews. The phone rang and she saw that it was Andrew, detective, who was helping her with the investigation. Hey, what's up? She said tiredly. I found some interesting information. It turns out that shortly before he was lost at sea, Daniel took out life insurance on his life for a substantial sum. The beneficiary of the insurance is listed as an unknown girl. Alice shuddered and pressed the phone harder against her ear. Her heart began to beat faster. How's that? Tell me more about it. I'm going to check for additional details, but it seems Daniel was able to insure his life for some ulterior purpose. It's kind of weird. I think we should find out who the girl is and why Daniel left her the insurance, Andrew said. Shock rippled through Alice's body. She was slowly realizing that her husband, her beloved and closest person, might have married her for some obscure purpose, only to die afterwards and leave the money to some unknown person. The thought seemed both absurd and eerie at the same time. I can't believe it. It's horrible. What kind of person would do such a thing? And who is she, this girl? We must certainly find out. Of course, I won't give up the search. Let's see this investigation through to the end. Andrew's voice began to get lost in the storm of emotions that such strange news left behind. Okay, sorry, I've got a case. I need to finish it. Need any help? I'm out of town. I think I can handle it. I'll be in touch if you need anything, Alice said. Andrew dropped the call. There was a short beep on the speaker. Alice entered the orphanage. 3 little kids of about 5 years old, playing in the hallway and unaware that their Aunt Alice had come to meet them, caught her eye. My heart sank. There was too much character in their faces, and they were similar to each other, giving away their origins. "Hello, who are you here to see?" the woman asked, smiling at Alice. "You know, I have a strange request," Alice mumbled. At that moment, her heart beat harder. Alice wanted to make sure that she was really related to these children. "Could you give me samples for DNA testing on these kids over here?" Alice said, pointing to her nephews. "I don't know what you mean," the woman frowned. "I recently found out that I might be related to them, and I'd like to run a test. If it turns out to be correct, I can take the children, can't I?" Alice could feel the excitement twisting everything inside. When she had come to the clinic to have the DNA test done to confirm her parentage, the doctor had immediately warned her that she would have to wait. "And how could it even come to this?" Alice muttered, rubbing her palms together nervously. She waited for the results of the tests with hope and fear, which was already habitually present in her life, only changing its appearance from time to time. Finally, the result was ready. "Well, here are your tests," the lab technician said, holding out an envelope. "The result is positive. Congratulations, or is it sympathy? I don't know what your reason for doing this test was." Listening to his words, Alice shook with excitement. She slowly opened the form and carefully read the small lines. Soon she was back in the orphanage director's office, holding the papers with the results. Her heart was beating harder than ever. "Hello, Alice Wright. What a familiar face you have. What can I do for you?" the principal asked. "Yes, that's right. I came back with the results of the DNA test. The children that were given to you a while ago are my nephews. The test confirmed the parentage," replied Alice. The principal was stunned by the news, but then his face suddenly lit up with memories, as if he finally realized why she seemed familiar. "You know, I have a great memory for alumni," the principal said cryptically. "But age, I repent. It's only just now dawned on me." "Why? It seems as if I've seen you before," Alice marveled. "Really, yes, I remember that girl and their mother, and you when you were barely older than your nephews. You were sisters, and then you were separated as infants. But not me. I was working as a caretaker at the time, and had no influence on anything." Once again, Alice felt her heart clench at the truth that had been revealed. Just like that, a phrase dropped so easily had completely shattered the life she was used to. "Yeah, it's weird. I was sure that I was my parents' own daughter, and now I realized that I always felt something was wrong." Tears came to her eyes. Trying to save face, Alice furtively wiped them from the corners of her eyes, but the gesture didn't escape the principal's notice. "This is a difficult moment, but it's also a chance to be reunited with your family. I hope you can help them once things are settled," he said. Alice felt joy, but also fear and uncertainty about the future. But she knew she now had a purpose to be who she really was and to take care of her real family. After a very long time, Alice returned to the principal's office once again. His name was Christopher Valentine, and this time they had time to get to know each other properly. It wasn't easy. I spent a week trying to get all the right papers together, going through a lot of restrictions and red tape. But when I saw their smiles, when they saw me for the first time, all the difficulties turned out to be for naught," Alice said softly. Christopher Valentine looked at the newfound guardian of 3 little ones with a smile and nodded at her. "You know, no hardship can compare to the joy you have brought to these children and their smiles, a reward for your selfless care." Alice smiled and sighed. "Thank you, Christopher Valentine. I must do everything in my power to provide them with a better future." The joy of motherhood, unavailable to Alice before, colored her life with pleasant colors. However, the shadow of the unknown still lay over the story of Daniel and missing Katie. Alice met Andrew at the cafe to discuss the results of his investigations. "Well, did you find anything new?" Alice asked. Barely had he crossed the threshold of the coffee shop. "Yes. Alice, I found the name of the girl who was supposed to be paid the insurance money on Daniel's policy. Her name is Lucy Crawford," Andrew replied. Alice paled slightly when she heard the name. She had heard it before, hadn't she? Lucy Crawford. Turns out Lucy worked as a secretary in the department of your company that Daniel headed. It turns out my little investigation uncovered a little more curious details." "What curious details?" Alice asked. Andrew's words left Alice perplexed and alarmed. Why would the secretary receive an insurance payout after his death? Why not me or his relatives, she thought. "I think a little. Alice, you're not a stupid woman." Andrew shook his head. "Of course, we don't know all the details, but from all appearances, there was an affair between her and Daniel. That relationship could have gone very far and apparently led to something bad." Alice froze, trying not to breathe. It seemed that one careless movement and she would crumble. The secretary's affair with her husband. The insurance policy all pointed to the fact that she might have been involved in his death. Maybe she's the killer? Alice's mind flashed. She leaned back in her chair. A heavy feeling of disappointment and loss came over her. Alice picked up her briefcase, looked up, and headed in the direction of human resources. She hoped to find out how to contact Lucy Crawford so she could locate her and get to the bottom of this situation. "Hello, I'm looking for information on an employee of Lucy's. I need to get in touch with her," Alice said. When the human resources manager came out to her, she looked at Alice with surprise and then smiled. "Lucy Crawford? You mean the former employee? I mean, she quit just a day ago, decided to move to another company. He didn't even do her 2 weeks. I don't know who her patron is," the manager replied. Alice was shocked. Why did she quit? Where does she work now? That's the thing. Moved to our competitors after leaving her application just a day ago. Said they offered her more favorable terms, but it's strange that she left so suddenly. Alice realized that her target had slipped away at the last moment. She needed to find Lucy and find out the truth, but that was proving more difficult than she had expected. Andrew didn't call until a few days later, when Alice was finally desperate to find anything. "Alice, I've managed to track Lucy down, and I have good news," Andrew announced from the doorstep. Months of investigation and constant communication had melted the ice between them. Now they were a little closer than just colleagues. Andrew even caught himself thinking that Alice sympathized with him as a woman, but he wasn't in a hurry to give in to his feelings. "What is it?" "Tell me already," Alice said impatiently. "It turns out that Daniel is alive." Andrew immediately stunned her, and he was closer than you think. Not far away at all, in a cabin in the woods, almost near the edge of your town. Alice felt a whole wave of feelings. When Andrew had informed her that Daniel was hiding near their house, at first it had been surprise how was that even possible, then relief at the thought that her husband was still alive. However, that was quickly replaced by other dark emotions. "I didn't want to bother you right away. That's why I called the police to begin with," Andrew continued cautiously. "What, they detained him? Why did you decide that without me?" "I just did my job," Andrew shrugged. "I didn't piss you off for helping me find the truth, not to put my husband behind bars. That's what interrogations are for, among other things, to find the truth." "I'm sorry, Alice, but Daniel confessed to everything." Andrew shook his head regretfully. "To everything he said. Told me that his intentions were unfair to you. He knew the code to your safe and was going to rob the house, just waiting for the right time." "Ah, I can't believe it. He was willing to do that in his own house." As Alice realized the news about Daniel, her soul filled with a mixture of grief, disappointment, and a sense of betrayal that expressed itself in tears on her cheeks. "Yes, that's exactly right. But thanks to the quick work of the police officers, we were able to thwart his plans. He repented and signed a clean confession." Andrew tried to support his friend. "Yeah, it's hard to digest," Alice muttered, looking down at the floor. "We've been through so much already. Now this. But I guess the important thing is that he's alive and will be punished for his actions. Yeah, it's not your fault he turned out to be a criminal. A fake death for insurance for a mistress. A robbery. You didn't deserve all that. But at least Daniel can't do any more harm. That must be hard. But you have to remember, you have those who are there to support you at any time." "Thank you, Andrew. You've done so much," Alice whispered, shaking her head. "Always happy to help. You're a strong woman. You're sure to get through this." Tears rolled down her cheeks, leaving salty trails. After Daniel's capture, the days stretched on. Andrew had offered to arrange a date with her ex-husband, but Alice had refused, not wanting to see the unhappy traitor. Now she wanted to concentrate on getting on with her life and regaining some semblance of footing. One day, Alice decided to call the office to see if everything was all right. Helen, as usual, answered her call in a businesslike manner, but the conversation suddenly descended into strange happenings. "Alice, how are you?" "We've been worried about you," Helen said. "Thank you. Yes, more or less. But we need to move on somehow. I understand we haven't worried you, but do you know about Lucy yet?" "What happened to her?" Alice was wary. An ominous foreboding settled in her soul. "Turns out she just betrayed Daniel, and it looks like she started gathering some dirt on her new bosses," Helen said. "They fired her, set up an internal investigation, and then concluded that she was involved in insurance fraud. So Lucy ended up in jail too, just like your ex-spouse. It's kind of a nightmare. All the seemingly familiar people have turned out to be crooks. I feel like my life has changed irrevocably." Alice realized that she needed to move on despite all the obstacles, but she was too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. In a big cozy house surrounded by greenery and flowers, she took care of her family, setting up house for the children, building place and play and learn. These boys were like her own children to her now. She did her best to make their lives happy and carefree. The little ones, barely learning to talk, were full of energy and questions. Alice taught them by playing interesting educational games and helped them explore the world around them. In the evenings, they gathered together in the living room. Alice read stories before bedtime. After a while, Alice and Andrew stayed in a small room after the operation. There was silence, and both realized that they now had a chance to talk alone. "Thank you, Alice, for finding the strength to talk me into this examination. I didn't think I'd ever walk normally." "You're a brave man," Andrew said. "You've overcome so much in life." "I was sure you could do it," Alice replied. "But I have to say, I couldn't have done it without your support. You've always been there for me. And I'm very grateful for that," Andrew smiled softly. "Friends are supposed to help each other through the hardest moments," Alice smiled back timidly. "I want you to know how grateful I am to you. I mean, you literally changed my life," Andrew said. "And you changed mine too," Alice replied. Their eyes met, and in that moment, words became superfluous. Smiles of happiness and gratitude played on their faces. They knew they now had their whole lives to share together. The hospital room was filled with soft light streaming in through the half-closed curtains. Andrew lay on the bunk while Alice sat next to him, holding his hand in hers. It was at that moment that they realized something had changed between them. "Alice, I feel like I've gotten to know you better than I ever have. You're so caring, so kind," Andrew said. "It's been mutual. You were the only one who stayed by my side when things were hard for me," Alice replied. Their hands began to squeeze each other tighter. "Andrew, the moment our eyes meet, I realize that I feel something more than friendship for you. I like you," Alice whispered, desperately embarrassed. Her heart pounded in her chest, making her whole body tremble with excitement and fear. She had decided to take this step, no matter what, because she wanted to be honest with herself and with the man she could love. "Me too, Alice, I can't imagine my life without you. You fill my heart with warmth and happiness," Andrew replied. They drew closer to each other and their lips joined in a tender kiss that was full of feeling and promise. Their love, which had arisen at the most inopportune moment, turned out to be real and strong, ready to cope with any difficulty. Katie's babies had long since grown accustomed to Alice's home and were an endless source of joy and laughter for their new caring mom. She hired a nanny for them, who took care of the children in her absence. But as it happens, even the most caring nanny didn't always have time for everything, especially considering the 3 active toddlers. Recently, the children started talking about something strange. They claimed to have seen their mom when no one was home. This woman was sad, but always read them stories, talked, and comforted them. They said that Katie would come to them in their room. "That sounds kind of weird. I think you should seek medical help, consult some doctor, although it could just be a childish fantasy. But yes, Andrew, you're right. We can't let this go unchecked. These are my children, and I don't want them to be threatened by anything," Alice said. At first, she thought it was just a fantasy, but as time went on, she began to notice strange things. Food was disappearing from the refrigerator. Things were moving around, and she felt like someone was watching her. This caused her anxiety and even some fear. Andrew moved into Alice's house, and together they decided to start solving the mysterious incidents that were happening to the children. They set up cameras in the house, hoping to record anything that might explain the children's strange stories. Andrew went on duty. He stayed up nights studying the camera footage and waiting for any unusual events to occur. But the long nights passed without any sign of any obvious manifestations of mysticism. He began to think more and more often that the children were badly mistaken, and perhaps this was just a figment of their imagination. A few days later, when everyone had decided that the children had simply made up the story and the night watch had been lifted, the little ones again said that Mommy was coming. This conversation caused Alice and Andrew to turn on the video cameras again, and their attention was drawn to the screen. "Do you see this? She comes at night to see the kids. It's really catty," my sister Alice exhaled excitedly. "I wonder what made her come back after all these months. I don't know, maybe she sensed the boys were in danger, or maybe she needs to pass something on. Let's find a way to contact her. Figure it out." But she comes on her own. Just waiting for another visit is enough, Andrew shrugged. "Yeah, we can't miss the chance to find out the truth. Why she's back and where she's been disappearing to in the first place," Alice agreed. And then one night they finally had their luck. Katie sneaked back into the house, thinking everyone was asleep. But Andrew and Alice were ready, meeting her right in the hallway. "Katie, hello there. We need some answers. Why are you coming back like a thief now?" Alice asked. "Yeah, I come to see them, to be closer to them. "But I didn't hurt anyone," replied the guest fearfully. "We've seen the camera footage, and we know you come when everyone is already asleep. Why all the secrecy?" Andrew frowned. "Please understand me. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to be around the kids," replied Katie. "Then why did you disappear? We all thought you were in trouble or dead." "What happened?" Alice asked, softening her voice a little. "A man owed a lot of money," began Katie explaining. "And when he realized he didn't have it, he decided to bail me out, said he didn't need me anymore. But I guess they weren't happy with that exchange," Andrew said. "No," Katie shook her head sadly. "They killed him, and then they came after me as a witness." A confused but determined Alice walked over to her sister, who was shuffling nervously from foot to foot at the door. "Katie, I'm sorry you've been through all this. We can help you, but you need to cooperate with us. Turn yourself in to the police. Running away is not the answer. Let's talk about how we can do this so you can be exonerated." "You don't understand. I didn't kill my stepfather. It was his drinking buddies. They were behind the horror," Katie said with tears in her eyes. "I believe you. We'll get a good lawyer." "Yes, Katie, I know a good one. He's a real professional. He'll work on your case and prove that you're innocent. All we need is your consent to find out," Andrew said confidently. "Do you think it'll work?" Katie asked hopefully. "Absolutely," Alice nodded. "We won't leave you in the lurch. We're family." Katie, still covered in tears, hesitated at first, but then she took a deep breath and nodded firmly. "I don't want to run and hide anymore," she said. The police and Andrew breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that they were on the right track. Alice put her arms around her sister and stroked her back, comforting her. "It's the right thing to do. Katie will be by your side every step of the way." While Katie provided information to the lawyer, Andrew, like a true detective, continued his investigation. He checked all available evidence, conducted interviews, and soon conclusive evidence was found that Katie was innocent. Alice and Andrew supported her. They came to see her when she was in custody, discussed plans with her lawyer, and were always there to support her morally. Every look, every gesture said that they believed in her innocence, and finally the big day arrived. In court, all the evidence prepared by Andrew was presented, and after much debate, the court announced the verdict. "Katie, you are acquitted. Your innocence has been recognized by the court. You are hereby acquitted of all charges." Alice, Andrew, and Katie hugged each other joyfully. Tears of happiness came from all three of them, and it united them even more. Sitting in her cozy home, Alice decided to share some important news with her lover. Her heart was full of joy. She believed that Andrew would share her happiness, although she was a little apprehensive. "Andrew, I'm pregnant," Alice breathed out and stood waiting. "Alice, I love you very much," Andrew replied. They embraced, knowing that their future would be filled with joy and happiness. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Barbara suddenly interrupted their unity. Yes, is something wrong?" Alice and Andrew were immediately alarmed. "No, I mean with the children." Barbara lowered her gaze. "What is it?" Andrew intervened. "Alice, I'm sorry for reacting so emotionally. When I saw that mark on Katie's arm, it just shocked me. What's wrong? Why are you so worried? I saw the birthmark today, and it's exactly like the one on my daughter that I gave birth to many years ago. Are you sure?" Andrew questioned warily, shifting his gaze from his nanny to his lover. "Yes, that's for sure. I gave birth to 2 twin girls many years ago. I've long despaired of meeting them, but now with this mole, I have my eye on Alice." Alice felt her heart begin to beat more frequently. The conversation was too exciting not to affect her, but Alice was hardly prepared for the turmoil Valentina wanted to unleash on her. Sobbing but looking at the young people, she decided to share what had long weighed on her soul. Bitter memories came to the surface, and she began to tell her story. "A long time ago, when you, Katie, were just born, my husband met me at the maternity hospital," Nanny said bitterly. "He was so happy, so joyful, so full of hope, but everything changed very quickly. It was like he turned out to be someone I didn't know. When he found out you were born, he started celebrating with his friends. One day another, and then he just went on a bender, and suddenly our whole life was nothing but fear and violence." Alice listened with a shudder, realizing that this horror story was actually a chronicle of her real family. It was frightening to even imagine how much her mother had to endure. It was as if the weight of having children had changed him. He became more dangerous and tougher. "He drank, beat me, disappeared nights unknown," where Valentina continued in a trembling voice. "One day, in one of the worst moments, I grabbed a knife. It was all over. I don't remember how it happened, but I did it. I ended up being arrested and sent to jail. You went through such horrors, and it's all because of us," Alice whispered sadly. "No, it had nothing to do with the girls." Valentina tried to calm herself. "I lost my freedom, and you ended up in the little house, and then in the orphanage. All these years I searched for you, but the traces were lost. You ended up in a rich family, and Katie stayed poor. So I'm the bad mother, since I couldn't keep you from all those horrors." Alice hugged Valentina, trying to comfort her mother, who had experienced so much suffering and loss. "I can't imagine how much suffering you've been through. But we're together now. It's all in the past, thank you. Alice, I hope nothing can ever keep us apart again. I'm sorry. I overheard you," came Katie's voice suddenly. She had been standing in the doorway all this time, leaning her shoulder against the jamb. "Well, come to us quickly," then exclaimed Alice. The women gathered in the parlor to talk about what had happened. It was necessary to reveal the cards to the end, so that no more secrets should poison the life of their family. Katie looked very depressed, but was finally ready to tell her story too. "I met my baby's father back in high school. We were classmates and started dating after graduation when he left for the army. I waited for him to come back. He came back. We got married. He became a trucker, and one day there was a terrible accident. He was gone." "Katie, I can't even imagine what you've been through," Alice said bitterly. "Yes, after he died, I lost the meaning of life, thought it was better to die. But my children, my little ones, they saved me from that terrible mistake. I realized that they were the only thing I had left in this world, and I did everything I could to protect them and give them a good future. Yes, you are very strong, but now we can take care of our loved ones together. Since fate has brought us together, I'm sure," Alice said, "we'll be together and we'll be fine. Yes, Katie, we'll support you. You're not alone anymore. You have both your sister and your mom, and we'll do anything to help each other." Barbara hugged her daughter gently. Many tears were shed that day, but in the end, the family came together, and a future filled with hope and love awaited them. "Mommy, look what a boat Grandpa made for me," Vivian exclaimed as soon as she saw it. It was early spring outside. The snow had just begun to melt, but all the puddles had already turned into streams, around which the children were running merrily, shouting and laughing. Everyone had paper boats, and some of them had real wooden boats made by their fathers or grandfathers on the weekend. Near a large tree, from which large drops of melting snow were falling, stood a girl of 8, tall for her age. She looked longingly in front of her. She didn't have a boat. Her mom was at work, so she couldn't make one. And the girl had no one else, not even friends. They had recently moved to a new house, and she had not yet had time to get acquainted with anyone, but she liked to go out. But it was hard to have fun when everyone was playing and laughing and no one wanted you. Lily sighed and pouted her lips in resentment. On a bench a little away from the brooks and trees sat a short old man with gray tangled hair and a gray-brown cotton jacket. On his feet were very shabby boots that must have been cold. He looked at the children with a smile, then shifted his gaze to the girl and lowered his head sadly. After a few seconds, some idea occurred to the old man. He jumped up from the bench and ran somewhere towards the house. He knocked on the door. A rather tall woman came out on the porch with a vacuum cleaner in her hands. She asked the old man something menacingly, but when he explained what he wanted, she nodded her head and went into the house. A few seconds later, she returned with a piece of paper. The old man nodded gratefully and returned to his bench. He began to fold the paper into something that looked like a ship. He did it in a very unusual way, in his own way, and even managed to attract the girl's attention. It should be recognized that this old man was one of those who, with his kindness and charm, could make people to himself. He was helped by everyone to whom he turned for help. Either he managed to pity them, or he was able to choose those who were able to sympathize. Nobody knew such people who would not refuse help, but everyone helped, and he never said no when he was asked. Maggie Swan, who lived in a house on the edge of the street, was an old and feeble old woman. She was so weak that sometimes she couldn't carry heavy bags home. Stephen, the old man, was always there to help. Maggie Swan often brought cutlets or soup to his home, an abandoned schoolhouse. Lillian watched the old man with interest as he folded the ship. When he finally finished, he smiled kindly at the girl and beckoned her over to him. Lillian's mom always told her not to go near strangers because they could hurt her, or take her away from her mom. And Lillian had always obeyed her mother's command. But not now. The old man's good-natured smile, curiosity, and desire to play with everyone made her go to the bench. The old man silently handed the girl a small snow-white ship made of thick paper, almost cardboard. It was unusual, not like the others, big, with sails and masts. Lillian did not know that such a thing could be made from an ordinary sheet of paper. Her eyes lit up, and she looked at the old man, as if he were a wizard from a fairy tale she had recently read. The old man nodded at the creek where the children were playing and smiled again. The smile lit up Lillian's face. She ran to play with the others, as if this ship was a ticket to a world of friendship and children's games. Contrary to her wish, the girl did not put the ship on the water and began to feel sorry for it. She ran with the boys, refused to exchange with the boys who offered their crafts. What Lillian got was attention and a desire to play with her. She didn't need anything else. She turned to see that old man again, but he wasn't there. The bench was empty. Lillian looked sadly at the ship and ran home. She would be sure to keep it. No other way, for it was a gift from a real wizard. At home, Lily waited impatiently for her mother. She had to come home from work in the evening, about 5 o'clock. The girl was so impatient to tell about the ship that she forgot to eat and did not even turn on her favorite cartoons, which were only on Saturdays and only at this time. She kept running to the window to see her mother's red coat or her blue beret. But Mom was lingering somewhere. When the hand of the clock passed 5, Lily began to worry. She didn't move away from the window anymore. Tears almost came to her eyes. What if Mommy, like Daddy once, didn't come? The girl was afraid that it would happen again. But fortunately, this time her fears were in vain. Lily's mom, Vivian, came half an hour after the promised time. Lily threw herself on her neck, not even allowing her to put the bags on the floor. "What's wrong?" Vivian exclaimed. "I thought you weren't coming as Daddy," almost sobbed the girl. Sweet Vivian hugged her daughter and squatted down. Lily, like most children, was often dramatic, but it was enough to caress her, and her resentments usually ended after a series of favorite cartoons, or after a batch of ice cream bought especially for her. Now she wiped away her tears with her sleeve and smiled broadly. "Look what I have," shouted the girl and ran off to her room. Vivian smiled and shook her head, trying to get her boots off before her daughter arrived. Lily came running in just a few seconds later and held out a snow-white ship to her mother. Vivian took it in her hands and bowed her head. She examined it closely and came across a faded, barely legible inscription. The woman aghast and drew back, not knowing what to say. "Honey, where did you get it?" The old man on the bench, Lily shrugged. "He made it for me." "What did he look like?" Lily wondered. She wasn't good at describing people, so she could only name clothes. Vivian handed her daughter the grocery bags and asked her to sort through them, and went to her room. She sat down tiredly on her bed and sighed. The woman couldn't believe her eyes and still thought she had only imagined it. Vivian reached into her locker and pulled out an old shoebox from there. She carefully removed the lid with trembling fingers and exhaled noisily. Rarely did she have to open this cherished box. For years, it had been filled with old trinkets that anyone else would have called junk when they opened a shoebox. But for Vivian, it was the only thing that connected her to her parents. Or rather, so she thought. Vivian Laurel's mom was indeed dead. She had died of cancer when the girl was 13. Her father, on the other hand, had gone missing 3 years earlier. At the age of 13, Vivian was left alone. The boon of her upbringing was taken by an aunt, her father's sister, Helen. She was younger than her brother, unmarried, and belonged to the type of people who believed that nothing could be better than freedom. So she never restricted her niece in anything. However, her upbringing, too, she was not particularly engaged, preferring to write memoirs, go to modeling shoots and celebrate contracts with her many lovers, which she had at least 6 for the time that Vivian lived with her. Except the last one had lingered for 2 years with her son Damien. Ellen had never treated her niece with warmth or anything of the sort. She simply didn't care for the girl. At times she would walk into her room, look at Vivian aloofly, nod her thoughts, and leave. At the age of 18, she subtly began to hint that it was time for her niece to do the honors, and that she was too busy in someone else's house. From then on, Vivian started living on her own. She had been working part-time before, saving money for the future, and now she began to live on her own. 16 years ago, a 13-year-old girl named Vivian sat on a narrow bed with flowered sheets. She was holding a ship made of paper. It had a mast and sails, and was not like the ones the children played with on the street. The girl's face was streaked with tears. She looked sadly at the ship. Her hand trembled. "And what did you get me wrong with this toy?" "Aren't you 5 years old?" Rolling her eyes, she asked Ellen, who leaned against the door and looked at her niece. She was a tall, thin woman with long curly hair and a very pretty face. The woman preferred to wear expensive brand-name clothes and wore good makeup. As a child, Vivian often heard from her mother that she didn't know where she got the money for all this, because Ellen never had a proper job. Once in a while, she sold her graphomaniacal writings to publishing houses and received modest money for photo shoots as a model. "Daddy made this for me," the girl replied, coping with her emotions, and hid the ship in a small shoebox that stood beside her. When the lid was in place, Vivian clutched the box to her chest. "Your father has been gone for 3 years. No? There's no telling where he is," Ellen shrugged. "It's about time you started living your own life. Your mother wasn't very good at it, though." Vivian looked at her aunt with hatred and clenched her teeth. A storm of emotions rose up in her over the mention of her mother in such a negative way. The girl understood that she should not quarrel with her aunt, with whom she would have to live for a long time. But she was not going to listen to such statements about her mother. "It's a memory of him. Only he made ships like this. I know, because no one else had them. He used to leave his signature by folding the sheet in a special way. Would you like me to show you?" Ellen held up her hands, shook her head. "Looking at old paper always made me ache." When he had nothing else to do, he also stuck it to others. The look Vivian gave her aunt frightened the woman. She opted to remove herself from the small room, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. There could be no mistake. It was indeed the same ship. The same illegible letters were folded and stamped on the side as on the old, yellowed pieces of paper. Vivian folded the 2 ships and closed her eyes. "What if I'm just making this up to myself?" The woman shook her head. Nothing had been heard from her father in over 19 years. It was as if he had fallen through the earth. And now, after all this time, Vivian sees the same ship. What if it was just a coincidence? But she didn't believe in coincidence. Vivian believed in fate. Maybe it was her desire to have at least one loving relative. Except for her daughter, of course. But she was too young to confide her worries to her. Vivian had never been an optimist. Quite the opposite. Life didn't give her moments to believe in miracles or happy endings. First her father disappeared, then her mother died. A self-obsessed aunt became her guardian. At 19, it seemed that life was finally starting to get better. When the young girl was in law school, she got a boyfriend and they started living together. It seemed then that it would always be good. But fate never left Vivian. They just gave her a little respite. And then years later, there was grief in her life again. The usual ordinary grief. The woman was glad to have her daughter, but she was very afraid for her. In essence, Lily was all Vivian had left. And the tiny chance that her father was still alive lit a faint flame in the long-lost woman's soul. "Lily," Vivian shouted, putting the box away. She had never shown it to anyone since that day at Ellen's house. It seemed to be something private and intimate, something to be hidden and given to no one. "Honey, come here." Lily ran into the room. Her face was smeared with flour. It certainly didn't escape her mother's attentive gaze. Vivian looked at her daughter with that maternal look that made it impossible to lie. Lowering her eyes, Lillian confessed. "I dropped the flour. The whole packet. I meant to make cheesecakes this morning, but I remembered too late. I thought I'd have it cleaned up before you got here." "Kids," Vivian thought and shook her head. For a second, the heavy thoughts were gone from her head, and she looked at her daughter with a smile. Lily was the only ray of light in her life, and she wasn't ready to lose it. "Okay, we'll deal with the flour," Vivian said. "You'd better tell me, where was the old man who made you the boat?" Lillian sighed and tried to explain the place. Vivian had grown up in this town, so she knew the streets and nooks and crannies very well. However, even she had a hard time figuring out the location from her daughter's clumsy and slightly awkward description. "The garages are near the village?" Vivian shrieked when she finally understood. Lillian shrugged her shoulders. "If it's not them, I've completely forgotten the town." Lily didn't understand half of her mother's words, so she just nodded and pulled her by the hand into the kitchen. "Come on, I'm hungry." "Oh, you'll be hungry all day. I want rice with a cutlet." The girl nodded and rushed into the kitchen. "But first, let's remove the flour." Vivian grinned. A heavy sigh sounded on a cool spring street near a small village. It wasn't really a village, but a part of the city where private houses were still standing. When the center and most of the districts were given for the construction of high-rise buildings, the inhabitants of this part of the city refused, and there remained a settlement of private houses. It was quite small, but because of the heavy car traffic and the large number of plantations, it was sought after by teenagers in the evenings and children during the day. Vivian had no idea how her 18-year-old daughter had found this settlement if it was far enough away from their apartment. Instead, the woman was greeted by the familiar fresh air and a view that hadn't changed at all. It was worth saying, the settlement hadn't changed in the 10 years she'd been out of town. Unlike the town, where new stores, buildings, schools, and kindergartens had sprung up, here stood the old grocery store, where a tall, full-figured Nayli, who never wore a blue apron, probably still worked. Vivian and her friends often ran behind the garages or sat in the village's cowering playground. Besides, there were lots of abandoned houses here, a teenager's paradise. There were streams and puddles everywhere. But Vivian remembered the way to the garages. She knew she wasn't likely to find anything there, but it was worth a try. Then she intended to ask around. In a place like this, everybody knows everybody. Really, Vivian grinned. The garages hadn't changed at all, except that they were a little dimmer than they had been 10 years ago. They still stood close together. In the middle was a beaten path where teenagers ran around, and one garage had an old 9-wheeler on it. No one knew how it had gotten there, but it had been there since before Vivian had moved in with her aunt. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the bench where the old man had been sitting, according to Lillian's story. And a little farther away stood an old, centuries-old oak tree, its branches spreading out for many meters. There stood the girl. Vivian looked around more carefully, hoping to find some hint of the old man who had made the boat. "Girl, you shouldn't stand where the cars go," a loud, very sonorous male voice sounded behind her. Vivian turned indignantly toward the man and opened her mouth to say what she thought, but she failed. "Damien, are you okay?" she said. In front of the woman stood her longtime and not the most pleasant acquaintance. He was the type of memory that you didn't really want to remember. Tall, blonde-haired, and very much like her. Oh gods, How badly did Vivian want him gone, disappear, like her father had once been, without a trace? That was her ultimate dream at 16, the woman thought. To meet him now was a complete surprise to her. I live here. How you ended up here is the question, the man grinned. Damien was a year older than Vivian, but he was in the same grade as her. Due to a lot of moving around by his father, who was in the military, he changed schools often. A year after Laurel, Vivian's mom, died, Ellen got together with Damien's dad and the boy moved in with them. Or rather, he moved in with Vivian, for he shared a room with her for the next 2.5 years. It was a terrible 2.5 years. Vivian preferred never to remember them. 13 years ago, a tall, blonde-haired boy had flown into the room and thrown his backpack right onto the floor. The backpack was light. There were hardly any textbooks in it, but it hit the leg of a girl who was sitting at her desk trying to do her homework. It's worth saying, Vivian had always studied hard, trying to get good grades. But lately, because of the presence of an uninvited neighbor, she had fallen behind in her studies. So she had to do her homework when no one was in the apartment. Luckily, Damien liked to hang out after school with his buddies. "How many times do I have to tell you not to throw things in the room?" the girl asked angrily, not turning around. She had already started looking for her old headphones to isolate herself from Damien's chatter. Yes, it was his favorite thing to talk. While Vivian did her homework, he pestered her constantly. "This is my room too, Prickles. And you should stop worrying about order like this apartment is yours," Damien said. Vivian couldn't take it anymore and turned to face the guy. "You know, it doesn't matter where you are. Throwing things on the floor, talking loudly all night is unacceptable anywhere," she replied. Damien grinned and tossed the tattered tennis ball from one hand to the other. "You're too right, baby girl. We're only 9 months apart," the girl muttered resentfully and went back to her algebra homework. The headphones were finally plugged in, and Vivian could no longer hear Damien's annoying, mosquito-like voice. Not long after that day, Vivian lost her headphones. More correctly, Damien had ruined them, fed up with her ignoring his words. Then Vivian even cried. And now, many years later, she stood in the garages and looked at that same annoying and nasty face. Of course, they were no longer children, and Vivian herself had long since become a mother. But childish resentments don't just go away. That was why she felt a nasty suffocation in her soul, as if there had been an encounter she did not want. However, despite her feelings, Vivian smiled. "I recently moved here," she said. Damien shifted his gloves into another pocket and grinned. "I thought you had an apartment in Springfield, didn't you?" "I sold it," Vivian answered briefly. "And no, I don't want to talk about what happened." The man grinned. The familiar dimples appeared on his face. He was standing quite far away, but even from that distance Vivian could see the familiar light in his eyes. "Do you want to come in? I don't live far from here," Damien asked. "Or do you have something to do?" "Next time I will. Right now I've got 44 minutes before my shift starts. And I still have to find the homeless guy the 8-year-old kid described." Damien's eyes widened. He looked at the woman in surprise and grinned again. He didn't seem to understand anything, but he was insanely curious about the homeless man. Vivian didn't know if she should answer Damien, since she never liked him and only did nasty things to him. But sensibly, she briefly described the situation. She realized that it would be very difficult to find the old man without local help. Besides, Damien, like her, was a grown man. It would be foolish to ruin a chance to find a possible father because of a childhood grudge. "So you're looking for the man who made your daughter's boat?" Damien clarified. "I won't ask why you're looking, but I can't help you yet. I just bought a garage here. I don't know anything or anyone yet. But I'll be sure to ask around. Maybe someone can tell me something." Vivian nodded gratefully. She hadn't expected to be so lucky. It was the first time fate had taken pity on her. Given that it was Damien, though. "Give me the number," he said. Vivian looked at him blankly. "I'll call you if I find anything." "Or do you want me to pigeonhole the answer?" Damien snickered. "No," Vivian mumbled. There he was, the real Damien, sarcastic and sarcastic. "Too bad," the man smiled wryly. "I would have had to get your address." Vivian held back the urge to reply and handed Damien a business card. He took it and whistled. "Juvenile Inspector, Senior Lieutenant Adams, Vivian. Not bad. I never thought you'd be on the police force." "In Springfield, I was a specialist in another field, and here they just hired me to raise kids. I never thought I'd be doing that," Vivian replied. "I didn't see myself as a schoolteacher either," the man chuckled and punched the number into his phone. Vivian's eyes went wide. "What? No way. You were dumb as a cork. How could I be?" Damien rolled his eyes and shook his head. 13 years later, and you're still so self-righteous and self-important." "Who's to say?" Vivian snorted. "All right, well, if you hear anything, give me a call." She hurriedly left without saying goodbye. The thoughts and feelings of childhood returned. Someone will probably say it's strange that they're almost 30 years old. What childish resentments. But for Vivian, immersed in her own problems after the death of her mother and the disappearance of her father, it was the last straw. A drinking aunt, a strange man in the apartment, and a man who took her room and made her worry almost every day. She almost lost her gold medal because of him, and had a fight with her aunt so bad that she threatened to get rid of her niece. It wasn't just a childish grudge, it was something that couldn't be forgotten. "Baby, stay with Aunt Stacy. She'll look after you," Vivian whispered quietly in her daughter's ear. "But where are you going so late?" Vivian sighed. She couldn't tell her daughter the truth. "I was called for work," she replied. Lilia nodded and hugged her mother. "Aunt Stacy, I'll pick her up in the morning then, so I don't wake you up, okay?" Vivian said to her tall, thin neighbor. Stacy nodded. It wasn't the first time she'd stayed with a girl whose mother worked all the time. There were a lot of downsides to raising a child alone. Vivian left Stacy's apartment and went about her business. She got into the old car that had once belonged to her husband and drove off. At 12:30 at night, the bell rang. On the other side was Damien's slightly agitated voice, asking to come urgently to the abandoned school building. Vivian was angry. She just didn't understand what he wanted from her at almost midnight. But he was asking to come urgently. So she sent her daughter to a neighbor's house and set off towards the school building herself, remembering where it was. Night roads were a nightmare for the woman. She hated driving anywhere in the dark. The fear left over from the accident constantly rattled her, but the odd joking text messages Damien sent kept Vivian driving on. She just wanted to remember a couple of self-defense techniques and smash his smug nose in his face for upsetting her daughter and making Vivian herself drive at midnight to an unknown destination. Oh, how angry she was. But there was nothing she could do. She just gripped the steering wheel and read the dumb jokes and Damien's messages out of the corner of her eye. Vivian wouldn't be surprised if she arrived at the building and he was waiting for her with a smile and said he was just bored. The car had to be parked far away from her destination simply because the woman didn't know what kind of soil was there. Considering it was spring, there could be snow as well as knee-deep water. And that was a best-case scenario. Vivian climbed out of the car and turned on her flashlight. A good thing she had guessed to grab one, trying to remember the way to the abandoned school. Vivian tried to walk through the mud and snow. Good thing her shoes didn't get wet. Despite excelling in her studies, she always liked to have fun with her friends. She never lagged behind her girlfriends in relationships, also ran behind garages and came home after midnight tipsy. Really, it was once or twice, no more. Auntie was to blame. While the other girls sprayed themselves with tons of perfume and lit a whole pack to cover up the smell of cigarettes and alcohol, Vivian didn't have to do that. Aunt Eleanor didn't care about her. She was immersed in herself and her memoirs. Vivian wanted to listen to moralizing like the others, wanted to cover up odors and try to get out of the house after midnight, but she couldn't. Eleanor herself sometimes asked her why she didn't drink, invited her to her bohemian parties, and suggested her acquaintances as suitors. Because of this, Vivian often left the house or sat with her headphones on. At that time, she and her friends climbed all the abandoned houses in the neighborhood. Of course, the huge school building didn't go unnoticed. Memory did not fail Vivian. She identified exactly where the school was located. It was a huge, crumbling building that had once been the site of a factory, then a garment shop, and then abandoned. 10 years ago, the building had been considered a wreck, but now it seemed to be held together by nothing but good word of mouth. Vivian sighed and walked inside. She couldn't figure out what Damien wanted in this place or why he needed her. As she entered, she heard the annoying creaking of the wooden floor, which was like a sieve of mouse droppings. There was trash, cigarette butts and bottles lying everywhere. Vivian pulled out her cell phone and asked Damien where he was. In response, he shined the phone from somewhere above. "Where are you? Why did you drag me out of bed?" Vivian shouted. "Over here, Evans." Damien's voice sounded. "Damien." Vivian broke into a run, but the man's warning shout stopped her. Damien was hanging from a hole in the floor on the second floor. Apparently, he had fallen through it. He somehow kept his balance and even managed to hold the phone. "The floor is very unreliable. You get there, you might fall through it yourself," Damien explained, shining the light on the floor. Vivian nodded. She was well aware of that too. "Why didn't you call 911? Figured since you got me in here, you'd have to get me out," Damien sighed indignantly. "The guys told me about the local homeless guy who lives at the school. They say he walks around, helps everyone, and they feed him for it. Yeah, they give him clothes. Are you sure it's him?" Vivian asked excitedly, and then she stopped. "Okay, I get it. We'll talk about it later. For now, we need to figure out how to get you out. Shouldn't we call the emergency services?" Damien didn't have time to answer. The plank beneath him began to make an ear-splitting creak and squeak. Sure, the height wasn't too great. He would probably survive the fall. But it wasn't just the height. The first floor was full of beams, metal objects and such. If he fell on them, no ambulance would help. Vivian gasped and rushed up the stairs. For a second, she was seized by memories she'd rather not remember. Of that very day, she hadn't heard Damien yell. She only heard the damn boards that creaked like a crunch in her body and generally made too many sounds that just kept the woman from concentrating. She realized that the emergency services wouldn't make it in time. Remembering her lessons on rescuing drowning people, Vivian spun on the floor as soon as she heard the creaking beneath her. She prayed to God that she wouldn't fall. An image of a daughter who might be alone came to mind, but then another, darker and gloomier one. Vivian crawled harder. Carefully, she pulled off her belt. Vivian tossed one end to Damien. He tossed his phone back to the ladder and picked up the end of the belt. Vivian grabbed some kind of beam with her other hand and started pulling. "I'm not going to follow you," Damien warned. "No, I'm not." Vivian parried and pulled again. Damien started to crawl out of the hole, but it was painfully slow, and the floor beneath them creaked harder and harder. The man seemed to be stuck, thanks to the thick jacket that kept him from falling. However, it didn't let him get out either. Vivian managed to pull Damien out of his trap, and she was sweating. Her arm ached. When the floor was beneath the man, he crawled slowly toward the flimsy staircase. Vivian went down to the first floor first and sighed in relief as she unbuttoned her jacket. "You're crazy," Damien said, leaning against the wall. "I remember when we caught a guy last year, and I had to do a lot more pirouettes than that." The woman grinned. A second after she said that, a beam fell a few centimeters from where Damien was. It fell through to the first floor and split in two with a clatter. Both Vivian and Damien stood wide-eyed. "About time," Damien said and exhaled. "It could have been me." The angry look the woman threw at the boy was unmatched. For a second, it seemed like Damien would have chosen to go back. "Why the hell did you call me instead of the emergency services? Have you had enough of life, you idiot? Are you out of your mind?" Vivian shouted, approaching the man. "You're an idiot and a moron." "Are you scared for me?" Damien asked, perplexed. Vivian stopped speaking and leaned against the icy stone wall, crying. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held back as she always did. "I'm losing everyone," she said hoarsely. "And lately it seems to be my curse. I've lost my mother, my father, my husband. I didn't bury my mother in front of my children as a grown woman. When I was 13. I didn't understand what had happened or how this was possible. My father was out of my life even earlier, starting a series of these events. I was 10. I didn't even have time to memorize what he looked like. If it wasn't for the pictures, I wouldn't have known." Vivian continued in a shaky voice. "I buried my husband, not as a gray-haired old woman with trembling hands, but with a child in my arms, a 7-year-old girl who to this day doesn't understand why Daddy left her. And Daddy, at the last second of his life, called me. Not the emergency services, not the ambulance, but me." One traitorous tear rolled out of Vivian's eye, but she brushed it away so quickly Damien didn't notice. He'd been in an accident. The car flipped over, warped. It was impossible to get out from the inside. He realized that, so he called me and apologized. I was at work interviewing a witness. I was angry that he interrupted me. Then I got a voicemail from him. I wanted to open it, but I got a call from the ambulance. He was driving in the dark late at night, and he sent a video of him saying goodbye to his daughter. Vivian covered her face with her hands and breathed heavily. She couldn't understand why she was saying all this. Much less Damien, truth be told, he didn't care who to tell anymore. In the 8 months that Greg had been gone, Vivian had never, ever told anyone about her pain. "That's why I was afraid for you. Because I won't suffer another death. Especially one that's my fault," she said in a muffled voice. Damien put his hand on Vivian's shoulder. "I'm sorry, I really am. It was stupid of me to come here alone and call you." Vivian raised her eyes to the man and shook her head. "I'm just glad you're alive. I'm glad it's all over. Wait." Vivian's discerning eye spotted movement in the darkness, as if someone was standing there eavesdropping. The woman snatched the flashlight from Damien's hands and shone it into the darkness. A short man with a beard and mustache, wearing an old hat, a tattered cotton jacket, and old boots, was looking at her. Vivian recognized him. It was exactly as Lillian had described him. "Papa," she whispered. Vivian remembered little about her father. Vivian was short in stature, shorter than Laurel, and certainly shorter than Ellen. Her father had a tattoo on his forearm and a large scar behind his ear. Vivian didn't know where it came from, but she remembered her father telling more and more stories about its origins. At first, she believed it. Eventually, she realized she was being lied to. Now, an old man with gray hair and a sad, frightened look stood before Vivian, and she had absolutely no way of knowing if it was her father or not. She took a step forward, but Damien grabbed her arm. "Father, what are you talking about?" Vivian waved the man away and made her way toward the old man. With slow, cautious steps, she was afraid to startle him. Good evening. My name is Vivian. Your name? The old man smiled, revealing yellow teeth. My name's Stephen. Your father's name was Eugene, wasn't it? Damien asked with his usual sneer. Vivian rolled her eyes and chose not to answer. You don't recognize me. I realize it's been 19 years, but... 19? The old man interjected. That's the only years I remember. I didn't count, of course, but about 20 years ago I woke up in another city in the snow, remembering nothing. Stephen lowered his head and began to speak hoarsely, as if remembering something he very much disliked. Vivian listened attentively, trying to look at the unfamiliar features of his face. I lived there for a few years, and then I came to this lovely little town by chance. The people here were very kind. Not like the people where I woke up. They feed me, they give me water, they even give me clothes. And it's not a bad place to live. It's chilly in winter, of course, but I'm used to it. Shocked by the face and complete incomprehension, Vivian looked at the old man in front of her. She listened to him, and she felt scared, as if what he told her had happened to her personally. It was so horrible that she took a few slow steps back and leaned against the wall again. Damien touched her shoulder again and nodded, letting her know he was close by. So you don't remember anything that happened before you woke up in that city? Damien asked, giving Vivian time to pause. The old man shook his head. Do you have a tattoo of a ship on your forearm? Vivian asked. Stephen smiled as he looked at the girl and rolled up the sleeve of his wide jacket. There are dots right there. Ships. You know, I've always liked them. They're beautiful, you have to admit. Born to travel. We don't have the sea to get a glimpse of this splendor. The air stuck in Vivian's lungs and wouldn't come out. She looked helplessly at Damien and nodded. The man looked at the old man strangely. There was distrust and suspicion in his gaze. And the crescent-shaped scar behind his ear? Stephen shrugged his shoulders. I haven't had to look in a mirror in 20 years. I am, the old man said, nodding. Damien walked over to him and asked him to remove the hat behind his ear. There was indeed a large, thick scar that looked like a crescent moon. The man turned to Vivian and nodded. She couldn't hold back a sigh. Her knees trembled so hard it felt like the ground was about to go out from under her feet, and her hands couldn't grasp the phone in her pocket. Someone had texted. Right now, though, it didn't matter at all. Holding herself back, Vivian pulled out her phone and from under the case pulled out an old, tattered photo of her father and mother. They were smiling happily together and looking at the camera. Careful, Vivian. She held the photo out to Damien. He showed it to the old man with a flashlight. Do you recognize it? Stephen shrugged his shoulders as usual. The man, not so much. But the woman looks familiar, and she's beautiful. I think I've even dreamt about her sometimes. Yes, that's definitely her. I couldn't figure out where I'd seen her. She comes to me in my dreams, often talking nonsense. Well, that's not surprising. The cold makes you dream. That's my parents, Laurel and Yugi Swan. 19 years ago, my father went missing. He was short, with a tattoo of a ship on his forearm and a scar behind his ear. He made paper ships and gave them to children. How did you give a ship to my daughter? Vera asked. The old man listened to her in silence. Don't you dare say a word against it. There was a storm of emotions on his wrinkled face, from fear to hope. It seemed as if he were about to cry. And what makes you think I am your father, madam? He said at last. Yes, Vera answered distinctly. Why didn't you say you were looking for your father? Damien whispered almost in Faith's face. They talked Stephen or Eugene into having Damien come over to their house for the night and go to the hospital the next day. Admittedly, it wasn't an option Damien liked very much, his apartment having been turned into a sleepover. I wasn't sure. Vera shrugged and walked over to the sink to pour water. I couldn't tell you that maybe my father was a bum who gave the kids paper boats. I thought I was crazy. Besides, it's not your place to tell me that. Is it okay to bring him to my house? First of all, you suggested it. Second of all, it's not okay to bring him to my house. I'd have Lily come over in the morning and find a homeless guy smelling like garbage on the couch. Damien nodded. Okay, Vivian, I get it. I have a former neurologist who works at Central Hospital. I'll call her in the morning and see what I can do. Yeah, well, call me and I'll try to get there early. There was a loud sigh. Damien rolled his eyes expressively. Where are you going? At 2 in the morning. Stay. I've got a great bed. I also have a folding chair bed. Girl, you have clothes to sleep in, don't you? Vivian nodded. She was very tired and didn't even try to refuse Damien's offer. In the few hours they had spent together, the hatred and bad memories had faded away. Maybe it was the fatigue that had caused it. Or maybe Vivian finally realized that they weren't children anymore. Despite their tiredness and even disconnectedness, neither Vivian nor Damien wanted to sleep. The man stripped the bed and spread out the couch. At first, Damien tried to walk quietly around his apartment, but then he realized that it was very difficult to wake Stephen. It wasn't surprising, though. Stephen slept in an abandoned building next door to alcoholics. They hardly behaved quietly at night. Vivian made tea for 2. A man came in and plumped tiredly in a chair. So why a former doctor? Vivian smiled and sipped her green tea. It should be clarified that Vivian liked to steer the topic away from herself. She hated being the center of attention. The reason for this was that she was afraid, being always in her aunt's house, to be an appendix to the apartment rather than a member of it. Vivian carried this behavior into later life as well. She hardly had any friends. Those couple of colleagues from work and former classmates remained in Kasimov, where the woman had lived for the last 10 years. She did not make acquaintances in the new city, and admittedly she didn't want to. For example, Vivian met Stacy by accident, having mixed up the doors of the apartment in the building where Lily and Vivian live. Not all the apartments have a number on them, because the house is newly built, and not even all the apartments have been sold yet. Those who have already settled in have put numbers on their doors. Vivian and Stacy, who had just moved in, didn't have time to do that. Late one night, after hanging out with a rude teenager who had been drinking, Vivian came home and got the wrong apartment door. She banged on Stacy's door for 20 minutes before she called the police. It took the police officer a long time to figure out what had happened. Damien grinned and shook his head. Vivian noticed that he was doing that a little too often lately. Do you care about that? Vivian shrugged and took another sip of her tea. It was hot and warmed her body. It was only now that she realized how tired and cold she was. I was afraid, she said reluctantly. We didn't see eye to eye. Vivian laughed. It's not for me to know that it's almost impossible to get along with you. Damien smiled. But that phrase is almost always an excuse. So what happened? Did I cheat? No, of course not, the man brushed it off. She just wanted children. All her life she'd dreamed of a big wedding and a family. And I was 22. I'd just gotten back from the army, and admittedly, I wasn't planning to have kids for the next couple of years. Of course, we tried to live together, to stop quarreling, but in the end, she left. Dina smiled sadly. I drank tea without sugar. Do you remember? It's nice. It's hard to forget. I used to run to the kitchen and make you tea 5 times a day because you were lazy. Maybe I liked it when you looked after me. No, you just liked picking on me, Vivian grinned. glancing at the wall. While Damien was gone, she had time to look around the apartment a bit and was basically surprised. Despite the outside clutter, it was clean. The one-bedroom apartment resembled the one Vivian had lived in with Ellen. A large room, a living room, and a small bedroom. The kitchen, surprisingly, was done in very nice modern colors with a tall table and a few paired chairs. It wasn't hard to realize that the man lived here alone, though. There was one skillet on the stove and one plate and fork in the sink. There was one cup on the countertop. Vivian had to work hard to find the other cup. "So what's your ex-girlfriend's name?" "I get it. You just don't want to talk about it, right?" "Okay, I played along. Her name was Abby, and she's a great name. The girl's a great neurologist and probably a good wife. She's also a mom, had a son a few years ago, and surprisingly, I became his godfather." "No way. I've always found it hard to maintain good relationships with exes. How would I know, though? My husband was my only partner, and he died. So tragic and pathetic. He died and I stayed." Vivian pitched forward and opened her eyes in surprise. "No way. She's 90 years old." 82 was celebrated at the beginning of the year, Damien replied. "She still tells stories about being in England in 1950. Vivian couldn't stop laughing. It felt like someone had jammed the on button. "I can't understand how you got into school," she said with a laugh. "I could never associate you with a teacher, except as a criminal." "Did you ever associate me with anyone?" Damien asked, smiling with the corners of his lips. The silence was more eloquent than any phrase. Vivian had never really seen Damien as a good person, never thought he'd become anything more than a bully. "There was a time when there was no work at all. My father was drinking himself to death, going crazy," Damien said, shifting the mug of tea from hand to hand. "There was nothing to live on. My neighbor worked at the school as a vice principal. She'd retroactively enrolled me in some kind of teacher training course and got me a job as an OBL teacher in September. Hotabike had just retired." "Hotabike? What did they call the old OBL teacher who wore a long beard and was bald?" Vivian asked. "Surprisingly, I liked it," Damien continued. "The pay wasn't great, but it was livable. I graduated as a history teacher, and now I have 2 jobs in classroom management." Vivian and Damien talked a little more about different things: work, family, and the past. They talked about the past only in passing, trying not to talk about how they felt about each other. For the first time in years, Vivian closed the gestalt of her resentment over what she thought was a spoiled childhood. "Thank you," the woman said as she and Damien went to bed. The man looked at her perplexed. "For keeping the conversation going and not letting me shut down," Vivian explained. Vivian leaned forward and opened her eyes in surprise. "For keeping me from thinking about what's going on with me and my father." "You're welcome," Damien replied simply and succinctly. "I've always done this. I'm not used to it." "What are you talking about?" Vivian asked, confused. "When we lived at Aunt Lily's house, it happened a lot. She'd say something to you, and you'd dwell on the words, the thoughts. I could see how you couldn't handle the flow of thoughts and delusions in your head. That's why you were talking nonsense. You were just trying to distract me from thinking." Damien shrugged. "Sometimes I just like to piss you off," he said, and retreated to the bedroom, where he went to sleep in a small and hardly comfortable chair, leaving Vivian alone with her thoughts. She couldn't believe it. She really had a fixation on what she was being told. Vivian spent long periods of time thinking about problems and their solutions, and knew about the problem, but she could never think that Damien noticed it. However, they had lived in the same room for several years. It would have been strange not to notice it. "We've got a lot of tests to do, of course, MRIs, blood work, and so on." Abby turned nervously to the door of room 8, where Stephen was lying. Besides, it's important to get him out of the state he's in right now, since he doesn't have any identification. My hands are tied. If the story Damien told me is true, you should start recovering the documents immediately so we can start treatment. Abby was a petite blonde woman wearing square glasses with a round face and dimples on her cheeks. She smiled at everyone and was polite. She was also very excited about Damien's arrival. She seemed to really care about him. Only Vivian couldn't tell in what way she cared for him. "Thank you, Abby," Vivian said. "But if he hasn't had memories for 20 years, can they come back?" Abby put her head down into the clipboard. 20 years is a long time," she replied. "Patients usually recover quickly with supervision," Amy said. "But your father has signs of frostbite, signs of beating. He's also probably been drinking and smoking. Plus, he was eating leftovers. That obviously didn't make things any better. Also, for memories to come back, you need familiar surroundings, familiar people. And he was living in an abandoned school, and hardly anyone was trying to help him. I can't say for sure, but the chances are slim to none. We'll do what we can, but I can't make any promises. Especially not until he has his papers." Vivian covered her face with her hand and shook her head. She didn't know what to do or how to be. The situation was getting worse and worse by the second. "Thank you, Abby." Damien smiled and walked away with Abby somewhere. When he returned, Vivian looked sadly at the room where her father lay. The orderlies had cleaned and dressed him. Vivian had brought new clothes. Now the woman was sure this old man was her father, short, with blue eyes, a scar and a tattoo. She had found him. Except he didn't remember anything. And that was terrible. Damien called out. "I've been thinking about the documents. We can't recover them yet." "With a stone in my heart," Vivian said. Her words were soaked with grief and heaviness. Dad had a business, apartments, money, and he disappeared too suddenly. And he was in a foreign city. Mom said he was away on a business trip. When he disappeared, he flew out. But he couldn't come back. And I think it's for a reason. He's clearly been helped to forget his life. If we recover the documents and his status, those involved might be very unhappy." Damien nodded and leaned against the cold wall, adjusting the white robe slung over his shoulders. 20 years have passed. Do you really think anyone still cares? I've been on the force for 7 years and, I've seen so much brutality. People are sometimes willing to remember things from decades ago, Vivian said. And if it's about money, they never forget. Yeah, I get it, Damien nodded. When you and I need to find out who's responsible for what happened as soon as possible. Otherwise, we won't be able to cure your father. Thank you for helping me and not going against my better judgment. You're welcome. Damien chuckled. I've never been against you. Immediately, a memory from 12 years ago came to his mind. What made you think you could yell at her? Damien had shouted in the face of Ellen, who was standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine, chewing slowly on an expensive cheese. Why do you think she is to blame for your troubles? She's been here longer than I expected. There's no point in living on my money. It's hard work, and she doesn't realize it, said Helene. Really? And what kind of labor do you do? Damien asked snidely, squinting his eyes. A third sentence a day. Or maybe sleeping with another man. Why are you looking at me like that? I know about your lovers and the fact that you're cheating on my father. So, you should tell him, Ellen whispered. You can't? Maybe because your daddy's a drunk and he's about to be fired from his job. Oh, you won't even have a place to live. So don't cross me, puppy. You got it? From the hallway came the sound of the door opening. Ellen smiled and waved her hand at the floor, where a large purple mug with some writing on it had toppled over. No, Damien shouted. Oh, Damien, how could you break your favorite mug? Ellen asked, deliberately loud. Vivian flew into the kitchen and saw the purple shards with the boy standing next to it. "How dare you? Crooked hands, you moron," she shouted. Damien sighed and gave Ellen a long look. These were his last days in this apartment, because soon this woman would kick both him and his father out. Damien knew that, but even more so, he realized that he couldn't do anything to change his mind, or he'd be on the streets for sure. He was sitting in his house when Vivian called and asked him to come over. Luckily, he had a sick day. After hearing about Vivian's problems, he realized he would have to take a mini vacation. Abby was happy to help open up the sick leave. To briefly talk about Damien, we can say that he is quite a kind person. Yes, in high school, and even in college, he was never known for being overly disciplined and submissive. And without hiding the truth, in the army too, not once fell for the rudeness of his superiors. However, with time it passed, and he began to take everything easier. He never refused to help anyone, but at the same time he was not particularly appreciated in the teaching staff. He often ridiculed other teachers, taking the side of students, realizing perfectly well that he had once been the same. Of course, no one could fire him. He did not break any rules, but good relations could not be built. The once popular boy turned into a man who rarely left the house. Most of his friends had left for other cities, and those that remained had families. Damien rarely went out for vacations, devoting most of his time to work. Vivian was a ray of light in his dull and ordinary life. He even enjoyed going to abandoned houses and trying to find Vivian's father. Damien got in his car and drove to the address. He didn't know what Vivian had in mind there, but he didn't care. Talking to her gave him pleasure. He was no longer thinking about how to make it through the weekend. His head was filled with other thoughts. The door to the Johnsons' apartment was open. "Damien, you come in," shouted a woman's voice from the far room. The man made his way there and saw a large desk piled with folders, with a laptop standing next to it, covered in pictures. "What kind of archive file is this?" Damien grinned and threw his backpack on the couch. "I had an acquaintance from the American Home Office send over all the documents for my father's missing persons case," the woman said. "And how did he send them so quickly?" "That you traveled overnight to Denver to get them," Damien wondered. "Vivian, you're a weirdo," she waved him off and walked over to the stack of folders. "Let's go look at everything." "Are you going to help or don't you think?" Damien asked, approaching the desk. "I need to find the culprit, or my father won't be able to go back to normal. Let's figure this out. You can take care of the laptop. There's a file on there with all of Dad's biography, his phone records, and his possessions. An acquaintance did a good job, though. He and I worked in Denver before he moved. He just happens to have access to the database, so he's helped me out a lot. Come on, the sooner we get started, the sooner we'll be done. Oh, by the way, Lily's gonna be here soon. We need to figure out what to tell her." A few hours later, the front door slammed and Lily came running into the room. She was happy and cheerful, clearly wanting to tell her mother something. When she saw the strange man, however, she was embarrassed. "Hello," the girl said quietly. Damien smiled and waved. Vivian took her daughter into the kitchen. She was gone for a long time, so the man decided not to waste any time. He continued flipping through the files. His gaze stopped on the largest and most labeled author's file. The man opened it and began to read slowly and thoughtfully. With each line, he was surprised more and more. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Vivian came back in and quietly closed the door. "She's really tired. She's already gone to bed. Good thing tomorrow is a day off. No homework to do." "Where has she been?" "Late at a friend's house." "Did you find something?" "What do you know about your father's business?" Vivian shrugged. "I was 10, didn't have much interest in it then, and when I did, there was no one to ask. I also knew why my mother and I didn't get the business. Yeah, they weren't married, so my mom's last name was Swan. We also didn't get Grandma's 4-bedroom apartment. Not for that reason. There's another, Damien said seriously. Listen carefully. When your father's firm opened, there was a stipulation that shares could not be inherited through bloodlines. That is, when one of the partners dies or withdraws, all the shares go to the remaining partners in the firm. Is that legal? Vivian wondered. Yes, but it's rare. I suspect your father didn't think much about family when he started the firm. He and Mom got together later. But that's not all. Do you know how many partners there were? Vivian shook her head and climbed onto the couch with her feet up. 4. Your father, Matthew, Johnson, and Smith. Do you know how many are left now? 1. Johnson. Do you think? Wait. 3 years before your father went missing, Matthew died. Heart attack. 41 years old. That early. That's not the only thing that's strange. The thing is, the will he left behind said his shares were to be inherited by your father. But that's impossible. He had no right under domestic law to transfer the shares to outsiders. But he transferred them to a partner. And your father got a controlling interest and the ability to run the firm almost on his own. But why did Matthew do that? Damien wondered. Matthew, the 3 M's. That's them on the boat my father made for Lily. There was a sign that's on my boat too. The 3 M's. Matthew. I don't remember much about my father, but I do know that my father fell in love with the sea when he met his friend. And everything in the house connected to the sea was connected to this friend. I couldn't remember his name, but I think it was Matthew. So he left a will to his father. Perhaps he knew or felt something. But that's not all. Damien continued. 5 years later, after your father went missing, Smith died of an accident. 5 years is the time frame after which a person is declared dead, Vivian said thoughtfully. Which means that, by law, the firm passes to the remaining partners, and Johnson, to get the full package, gets rid of the other partner. And remains the sole bannels of the firm, Vivian whispered. So you think my father was eliminated to get the inheritance? Yes, Damien nodded. I suspect that Johnson and Smith conspired to get 50% of the firm's shares that your father had. How did it go unnoticed? Didn't it become suspicious to anyone? They must have been quite cleverly planned, said Vivian, confused. Money is everything. You know who can live and who can't. The only thing that confuses me is the fact that your father is alive, Damien said thoughtfully. Matthew and Smith are dead, but your father isn't. And here it's simple. I think those who wanted to get rid of my father just hid him and dumped him somewhere. I don't know. He survived, and lucky for them, he lost his memory. It's scary to realize that, Damien admitted. But let's take our minds off it for a moment. Do you have coffee? Vivian nodded and got up from the couch. Her gaze was slightly detached. She wasn't looking around, her eyes were fixed on one point. Are you okay? Damien asked gently. So is there coffee? A few minutes later, Vivian was already standing at the stove, making coffee. You're not busy tomorrow? Will you sit with Lillian? I'm going to Casimov to see Johnson. I want to ask him something. Damien, who was sitting at the table, jumped up and in 2 steps was next to Vivian. Are you out of your mind? We just assumed he was responsible for 2 people being dead, 1 20 years without memory, and you decide to go straight to him and declare that you know he's a criminal. Don't scream, Vivian said tiredly, and lowered her gaze to Damien's hands that held her shoulders. She could feel his warmth and strong grip. Let me go, or the coffee will be on the floor in a few seconds. Damien slowly let go of her, looking down at his hands. He ah-hed, as if waking up. Apparently he had done it unknowingly. Are you worried? Vivian asked, not demanding an answer. I've worked with such personalities, so you don't have to worry about my safety." Vivian looked at Damien with disbelief. "I'll go with you," the man said firmly, his confident gaze fixed directly on Vivian. No arguments. "Yeah, I get why you're so involved in my problems," Vivian asked as they sat down at the table and started drinking coffee. Damien was taken aback and looked at the woman incomprehensively. "But you know, when I met you, the negative emotions that I experienced as a child flared up in my soul. It's childish, I know. Well, haven't you ever had that?" A quiet chuckle escaped Damien's lips, and he shook his head. "No. Maybe it's because I've never felt negative about you." "How could you? You were always playing tricks on me," Vivian exclaimed. "Yes, you said you talked nonsense when you didn't want me to dwell on my thoughts, but that wasn't always the case. You broke the mug my friends gave me, broke my headphones, made fun of me at school, and even told off the guys I dated. You ruined my life," Vivian said slowly, trying to control her sudden emotions. "Remember the new headphones for my birthday? Yes, it was the only present from Aunt Ellen in all the years. Why are you looking at me like that?" "No, wasn't that her present?" Damien grinned. He squinted at the woman, trying to figure out how someone so smart and savvy could be so naive. "The boys and I used to work part-time during the summer. I used the money to buy them. I didn't have enough to buy them, but I had to borrow some from my father. It was his stash in case of a hangover. I had a hell of a time." Vivian looked at the man confused. She gently took his hand and tilted her head. "Why? You needed them so you wouldn't listen to me. I saw how worried you were about them. I thought you hated me. Did you? Did you? I liked Vivian, and I was a stupid boy who liked her that way. Do you understand? It's a corny story, you say." Vivian stared blankly in front of her. In an instant, her world had been turned upside down. She felt that something was wrong, but she could never figure out what it was. Coping with her emotions, the woman jumped up from the table and announced, "It's decided. Tomorrow we go to Kasimov." "Vivian, my dear, is it really you?" "You were about 13 when I last saw you," asked Daniel Forrester, an older man in an expensive suit. He jumped up from his chair as soon as he realized who had come to see him. Damien and Vivian eyed the man warily. It was unclear why he was so hospitable to them. He took them to a local cafe and ordered several not cheap meals himself. "Don't worry, I'm paying. After all, this firm was built by your father with labor and sweat," he said. "It's a shame you couldn't find him. It was you who paid for 8 years to find him." Damien asked. Vivian looked at him shocked. "Yes, I had hoped to find something," Daniel nodded. "But it's like he's gone to ground. All your partners have disappeared, don't you think?" "I recognize my father's grip," Daniel grinned and smiled sadly. "Yes, it was like that. I honestly could never believe it was an accident. First Mike, then Eugene, and then Ben, one after another. I spent the next 6 years taking the trash out with security. I was afraid I'd suffer the same fate." "Weren't you the one who set that fate up?" Vivian asked me snidely. "No, I didn't have to. Ben's death, at least. After your father went missing, the controlling interest went to me, not Ben. Well, I mean, he split it between us, but I had 51%. That's better. Young man, I don't suppose you've ever run a big firm on your own. Believe me, it's not that easy. I was going to give some of my shares to Ben to take over. And Ben knew that. As a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience, I did the word processing as follows. And several other lawyers drafted the contract. And then Ben died in an accident. And there was definitely an accident. 2 other workers died on that construction site, safety violations. The site was just shut down. It's all in Ben's file. So I had nothing to do with it." Daniel Forrester smiled sadly and sipped from his glass of water. Besides, I definitely had nothing to do with Eugene's disappearance. I had no idea when or what time he was going home. Only Ben knew his flight time. Vivian looked at Damien with confusion. If Daniel Forrester was to be believed, their version was crumbling before their eyes. And Ben? How had he behaved in the years since Eugene Stepanovich had disappeared? Damien asked carefully. He was always calling someone and nervous. I was sure he'd just taken a mistress. You could hear in his voice that he was calling a woman. That's quite normal. For him, he was always very nervous and restless. They say that's why he died. You have to stay calm on a construction site. Vivian and Damien asked Daniel Forrester a few more questions and left. Already in the car, they looked at each other confusedly. Do you think it's not him? Vivian asked. Not only did he spend 8 years paying for the search, but he also erected a huge monument to your father. I read in the files he was actually going to give 10% of the shares to Kartashov, which would have made him the leader. I don't think he just changed his mind and took him out. And he couldn't have been involved in Mike's death because he was in Israel for over 6 months. How do you know all this? Vivian snatched the laptop out of Damien's hands and took a deep breath. Who gave you permission? You didn't think I'd let you go talk to an alleged criminal. Vivian turned away from Damien and muttered something quietly to herself. But Damien could see the edge of a smile on the woman's face. I can't get over the fact that Kartashov kept calling someone. I wish I knew who it was. 20 years ago, not everyone had a cell phone, and most people called from landlines. So the lady's number could have been saved somewhere. If Kartashov's things were still there, Damien concluded. Vivian grinned and started the car. I read something too. I can't believe you got into the house, Damien whispered and sneezed. Vivian drove them to the house where Kartashov had once lived. Because he had no one, the house was left empty and became just another abandoned building. In fact, no one lives here. So I don't see anything wrong with it, she said. Did you use a tire iron to knock the boards off the windows and get in? Damien objected. Oh, it's nothing. We'll write it off to the teenagers. Vivian shrugged and walked on, shining her flashlight on the way. Here, Damien shouted. Vivian walked over and saw the phone with the phone book next to it. How will we know which number we need? The woman shrugged and opened the dusty old book. Damien and Vivian gasped at the dust that rose. It's been so many years. After all, the book flipped through very quickly, pages skipping, until Vivian saw a number written in red pen. Judging by the spread of the book, it was the page that had been opened the most. The number had been circled several times in pencil. It's not signed, Damien said. It doesn't need to be, Vivian said sadly. I know it by heart. They walked outside in a terrible mood, not knowing how to react to the news. Damien looked straight into Vivian's eyes. He stepped closer to her and kissed her. Vivian was taken aback. What are you doing? You just got into the house, found the culprit. Well, almost. And probably helped your father. You're awesome. You know that? You're not what I thought you were either, Vivian admitted and blushed. Here's how I edited the continuation of the text according to your instructions. This is the first time in your life you've ever admitted you were wrong, Damien grinned, and Vivian punched him in the shoulder painfully. You can't make me change my mind. Vivian smiled imperceptibly. Ellen Swan, is that you? A tall man in black clothing asked, holding out his ID card in front of him. Did you know Ben Kartashov? No, the woman replied hysterically as she was questioned at the police station. Your phone number was found in his address book. There are also witnesses who saw you together." "So what?" "He was my lover," Ellen held her head high. "And the mastermind behind the attack on your brother. He was the only one who knew when he was going home. Eugene was attacked near the train station." "An attack?" Ellen shouted. "Are you out of your mind? Why would I harm my own brother?" "Your mother's 4-room apartment," answered the investigator clearly and succinctly. "You were up to your neck in debt that year. You had loans. And I suspect not only the banks owed. And immediately after receiving the inheritance, 6 months later you put the apartment for sale, and it was very quickly bought, which suggests that a buyer was found early. You paid off the debt, got rid of your brother, whose considerable bank account went to you and his daughter. And since she was young, her mother put her money aside. And when Laurel died, you got the rest. That's where you got the money for the social gatherings." "Ellen Swan, isn't it?" the investigator asked sneeringly. "Your niece has provided all the evidence that will help me put you away for a long time, as well as solve a case from 20 years ago. So you can go ahead and get a lawyer. Ellen, you're definitely going to need one." The investigator was an old friend of Vivian's. She heard the whole conversation thanks to the recording phone. They listened to the tapes with Damien. The man held Vivian's hand. "Did you win?" He smiled. "We did," Vivian corrected and squeezed Damien's hand tighter. 3 years later, a large truck labeled transportation stopped in front of the 3-story house. 2 uniformed men got out of the truck and headed toward the house, keys in hand. An older car was parked next to the truck, from which a blonde-haired man with a large bag on his shoulder got out. He surveyed the area and opened the back door. A tall girl of about 11 years old climbed out. She was smiling cheerfully and looking around, hoping to spot something interesting. She was holding a large paper boat. A short, bald old man with a beard got out of the passenger seat. "Loaders," he shouted. "Where's Vivian?" "She should have gotten here before us," Damien replied in a warm voice to the old man, Yugi. Damien shrugged and pulled out his phone to dial Vivian's number. "Probably socializing with criminals again. It's such nice weather and she's at work again," the old man complained. "Nature around here is so beautiful. May had blossomed, the smell of lilacs was everywhere. And the sun was shining so brightly that it seemed as if summer had already arrived. The trees were covered with little leaves. Birds sang on all sides. And the pond behind the house glistened in the sun. It really was grace. Not just nice weather, but Vivian was at work again. She had been spending too much time there lately," Damien thought. "Uncle Damien, look." Lillian shouted and pointed to the road, where a police car with flashing lights was coming at almost full speed. 100 meters from the 3-story building, she turned off the siren and began to slow down. The police car stopped in front of Damien. Vivian jumped out of the back seat and waved to the driver and his partner. "Thanks, guys. I owe you one. Good luck," she said. Vivian turned around to her family and was met with shocked looks. "What about you guys?" "Actually, they took my car, so I had to improvise," Vivian said. "Where have you been? Were you going to miss the housewarming party?" Damien asked. Vivian rolled her eyes and walked toward the house. She was in a great mood, and not even her lover's nagging would ruin this wonderful day. For the first time in years, Vivian felt at home in this unfinished building where new furniture had just been brought in. But this place was truly her own. Her whole family would be gathered under one roof, and for the first time in a long time, the woman felt happy. "By the way, you were supposed to be at work," Vivian said snidely, showing the movers where to carry the big couch. "It was your 10th grade class that had a concert in Italy near the principal's house. You got a call, but you didn't answer." "I don't take work numbers on weekends," Damien mumbled, wondering what kind of reprimand he'd get on Monday when he got back to his favorite 10th grade class. The head teacher had told him not to take those slackers. But could he refuse them? It was almost impossible. Oh, he'd probably lose his bonus. But what did he have to do with it? It's the end of the year. The boys are having their last free year. Why touch them? Damien froze. Vivian snapped her fingers in front of his face. She chuckled and walked into the house. These blackouts often happen when the man was thinking about something, especially in the last year. Lillian ran into the house first and immediately rushed to the second floor, where she chose the largest and most beautiful room. True, there was nothing special in it yet, but Yuji's grandfather already had a plan to please his granddaughter. Yugi hadn't regained all of his memory, but some of it had definitely returned. He couldn't testify in court against his sister Laurel because the doctors wouldn't give him permission. However, the prosecutor still referred to his memories. However, without his help, Laurel was sentenced to 11 years in a penal colony. And all the money and the apartment returned to the owner. It must be admitted, Abi turned out to be a good doctor. The first successes in treating Yuji appeared in a couple of months, and in 6 months he already remembered his daughter. A year later, Yuji remembered almost all the events of the last 30 years of his life. However, it was very difficult to fully recover his memory. Vivian could not get her father to remember how he met her mother. Yes, and much that was before the birth of his daughter he did not remember. However, that didn't make him any less loved. Lily got used to her grandfather almost immediately. She spent a lot of time with him and often asked for help. Yugi taught his granddaughter how to make paper boats and was very happy to have a family again. He smiled sadly as he remembered the years he had spent on the streets. Damien had also made friends with his father-in-law. Though it had to be admitted, he couldn't get used to him for a long time. His quiet and arrogant demeanor kept Eugene from trusting his son-in-law. Vivian was walking up the stairs to the top of the stairs. She took Damien under her arm and pulled him to the 3rd floor. There was the largest room with a huge window and a small terrace. Vivian and Damien had chosen this place for themselves together. The woman wanted a place to relax on the terrace with flowers, and Damien dreamed of sitting there and reading books. However, their desires did not contradict each other. As soon as the door leading to the stairs slammed shut, Vivian spun in place and started laughing loudly. Damien looked at her with a smile. "Have you decided to go crazy?" he asked. "I guess so. It's just, I feel like this is the first white streak in my life. Like there's never been one before." "A lifetime-long black streak," Vivian replied. Damien slowly walked over to her and hugged her. "May the white streak be as long as the black streak," he said. Vivian reached into her bag and pulled out a framed, yellowed ship. "This is where the symbol of our happy life will hang in this room," she said. The sun kicked out the village mother in a snowstorm. A year later, when he came to visit her, Emily lovingly stroked the smooth side of the glass cylinder with pickles, leaned over it, inhaled the pleasant aroma of fresh dill, garlic, cherry leaves, which she was sure to add to her preparations. Now she would close the next batch with metal lids, roll it up, put it to cool, and then take it to the cellar to the shelves. She thought for the 100th time that this year there was a good harvest of vegetables in the vegetable garden, and she herself would not go hungry in the winter. And she had prepared supplies for her son Archie in the city. Behind her back, in the corner of the summer kitchen, there was a faint sound and some inarticulate mumbling. It was her mother Helen awake, peacefully dozing, whispers, smells, the gurgling of pickles on the stove. A sturdy couch with a pile of old blankets and pillows had been there since ancient times. Now she had dragged Ellen there on her own to keep the old woman in sight. Although she was not quite ancient, only a little over 70 years old, she had not been on her feet for 5 years. The doctors then only waved their hands. We do not observe any physical abnormalities, no stroke or other symptoms that could give an order to the legs not to walk. There is no history of any. And they keep their lower limbs on their own. Your mother's more frail body refuses to fulfill its physiological purpose. Grandmother Helene is a well-known personality in the village. Back in the days when the Soviet kolkhoz ruled everything in the village, not a single matter of importance could be done without her ubiquitous nose. A small woman, just like Thumbelina, in appearance and in character. She could run the farm. Nobody drove the cows to the field for haying better than her. The men could never keep up with her. When she digs potatoes in her vegetable garden, people marvel. They are still checking where to put the tubers for drying. Ellen already has dry and even potatoes in bags, waiting for their hour. Lubia even called her our eternal engine. Where did they dig up such a term in those times? Peasants can't keep up with science. Someone from the visiting business travelers dropped this nickname. After the perky little girl, everyone picked it up at once. The village perpetual motion machine could not cope with the loads overnight. It fell out of working order, as if the battery inside had run out of charge. Emily herself was a tall and statuesque woman. Not a particularly fit woman, but she wasn't exactly overweight. She was all juicy, appetizing, tall, with huge blue eyes of all shades of cornflower, and a kerchief always tied around her, covering a mop of light, thick hair. Spoiled Max in the army and clothes. In the old days they would say, "Here she is, a real American beauty." But Emily didn't care for these compliments. She would pick up her mother, light as a fluff ball, and drag her into the cradle of an old motorcycle. She handled that mechanical inheritance of her father's. Her father has long gone to the other world, but managed to accustom his daughter to friendship with the iron helper. In the countryside, motorcycle a godsend, something to transport small things, to the store to run to get provisions, 1 centner of sugar for jams and compotes, and to buy on wheels a nice thing, to solve all sorts of problems. So now the street did not keep my mother in the 4 walls of the house. To the river to refresh in the cool water, while Mom on a blanket in the shade of willow will sit. Together they went to a distant berry plot with strawberries, red and black currants. Also in the company of Ellen. Emily wanders along the rows with a bow, Mom near the motorcycle on a blanket buckets with the harvest guarding. There, both women are not in grief alone. They have their own blood a point at their side. It's good to be alive. Infirm Matthew didn't see his beloved husband. He would have been sad. He burned to death 6 years ago from a simple flu. His immune system had already weakened with age, and the disease had a dead grip on him. He was almost 20 years older than his wife, and still remembered how their collective farm had been raised from the ruins after World War II. How they had plowed and sown almost by hand, without machinery. Matvey first saw the eyes of his young wife Helen among the cows. The sometimes capricious milk suppliers obeyed this impudent girl unconditionally. The man then thought that it seemed that the young lady was afraid of her soul and diligently gave her everything that had gathered in their uters. There was no time for dating and courtship in that hard time. At the evening in the village club, Matthew spoke to the locals as a specialist sent from a neighboring, more prosperous region to help. He called for victorious labor, inspired to exploits. After his speech, the girl herself came up to him and extended a small, strong palm. "You said everything right, comrade. Who, if not us, will raise the farm to new heights? Let's get acquainted. I'm Ellen. If you need help, please contact me." By the way, 40-year-old Matthew was very handsome and smiling, had that very male charm which the female sex will never pass indifferently. All the widows in the village were already looking at him with interest, but he did not notice anyone and nothing around him. As he came out of the club with Helen to walk her home and discuss the affairs of the collective farm, he fell in love definitively and irrevocably. His feelings were mutual. His soul was not embarrassed neither by the difference in age, nor by the sarcastic sneers of his comrades. Little girl chose an old man as her soulmate. A small gold mine, but a dear one. To the visiting father turned out to be, look, turrets, and the girl is spinning our collective farm leader. Matthew and Ellen got married right after the end of harvesting. The traveling specialist had no place of his own. Ellen's parents did not say a word against their love. He came to the Primakovs in a small house of his wife's parents and lived there for the rest of his life. Together parents, and in time spent the last journey. Next to the woman he loved, everything seems easier and simpler. After 3 years of marriage, they had Emily. I wish her parents had a brother or sister later. Yes, Ellen's doctors didn't advise her to take any more risks. There were delegations from the maternity hospital to the pediatric ward. The baby was born a girl giant, almost 60 centimeters of height and 5 kilograms of weight. The doctors were saying, "We have you, mommy, a total female anomaly. Such tiny babies do not give birth to such large babies. We could send your information to the Guinness Book of Records." Matthew and Ellen only smiled, so our father is 2 meters tall, a slouch in the shoulders. We have someone to give our daughter a big birth. Subsequently, no giant Emily was not marked. She grew and developed like all other peers. Beauty in her father, energy in her mother. It was a strange combination. Now she was approaching 50 years of age. And the fact that I was endowed with beauty from my parents and God, I never recognized it. She always walked past mirrors in passing, not looking into them unnecessarily, at dances and festivals in the shadow of other village beauties. One joy in the world's son Arson, who lives in the regional center. Now she will deal with cucumbers, zucchini, and cherry jam. Mom, thank God, with a bright mind and good memory, word and advice will always support. She would come and stroke her head, stare into her eyes with her clear gaze. I thought to myself that the fact that her mother's legs had failed was pain, hopelessness. That the hour of her husband Matthew came to the graveyard to come to terms. A woman in love with this loss could not. Her legs refused. But grooms on the now empty land for her without her beloved by her side to tread. Emily picked up her mother with a familiar motion, pulling her by the arm. "Now I'll take you, my good one. We'll have tea afterward. I got your favorite cookies from the store." Helene put her arms around her daughter's neck, pressed her cheek against her warm shoulder. "My poor girl. Why did you have such a heavy cross of struggle and loneliness in this life, forever giving your heart to one single man? Why have you suffered such anguish of womanly longing?" Images from 30 years ago swam before Emily's eyes. In the late 80s, the Soviet Union was like a colossus on legs of clay. Dusty, hot rural summers, the kolkhoz, which had given a lot of resources, could barely cope with the tasks. People fled to the city. Physical labor in the field was no longer the pride of the toilers. After the death of the communist leader, the country changed several rulers. The last one declared glasnost in the fight against drunkenness. It became unclear how to go on living. The collective farm managed to harvest watermelons and melons. A student group was sent from the city. They settled them in a school. No money was promised. The collective farm was impoverished, but they promised to feed them in the club so that the young people would not get bored. In the evenings, they played movies and organized discos. Emily had just finished school. She caught a cold when the students went swimming in the river. When it was time to apply for university, she dreamed of becoming a biologist. But the girl came down with a fever over 40. They wanted to put her in the hospital, but Ellen said that she would cure her daughter herself. At the family council, it was decided that she should not go to the army, but work in the village for a year, and the next year to enroll. A suitable vacancy was found quickly: assistant cook in the student canteen. 2 women did not have time to serve 50 people 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The townspeople were squeamish about rubbing the utensils with napkins, asking to wash the dishes again. They were in desperate need of a nimble and savvy helper. Here's my revision of the text, following your instructions. Emily recovered from her illness a week after the students arrived in the village. She had not yet met any of them. When Ellen's friend complained that she and her partner had been knocked off their feet in the dining hall, Ellen remarked gravely, "I'll be of more use in the fields and on the ruins of our once prosperous farm. And let Emily go and help. You needn't let her sit at home all summer. She's quite well now." The work in the canteen was marked by a bright, extraordinary event. The girl at the new workplace on the first day went with a tray full of glasses with compote. Before lunch, yes, on a small puddle at the table slipped. Set on a tray of fragile dishes flew to the floor, as in slow motion. A few seconds later, a bright maroon stain blurred, dotted with small glasses. Emily rushed to collect them in her apron, so that the students already at the tables wouldn't cut themselves. The treacherous piece of glass entered her hand so quickly that she didn't even feel the pain at first. Just above her palm, a purple stain began to blur. Droplets that looked like red rowan berries dripped onto the floor. Emily felt dizzy. The crowd gathered around her was shrugged off by some guy. "Get out of the way. My dad's a surgeon. I know how to provide expert care for wounds this deep. Get the first aid kit." What's a first aid kit in a village canteen? A bottle of iodine, an empty bandage packet, small narrow tubes of plaster rolled up like a roll, analgin tablets, that was all the medical stock. Seeing that the first aid kit would not help, the boy sharply pulled off his light-colored cotton shirt and tore it into a bandage, carefully took out the glass that had caught the end in the girl's arm, treated the wound with iodine, and wrapped a cloth around it. "That's it. You'll get to the local paramedic in peace now, and I'll walk you there. Let's get acquainted, shall we? My name is Vincent." Emily looked up at her healer. Tall, slender. The face of an intelligent city boy with gray, intelligent, age-inappropriate eyes. He looks at her directly, openly, with a smile. Vincent is already holding out his hand to walk together to the village nurse's station. He's even going to skip lunch for the occasion. He'll be hungry for the rest of the evening because of her. Some fellow was already holding out to Vincent the plaid shirt he was wearing over his t-shirt. The unwilling doctor deftly pulled it over his strong torso and smiled at the student. "I'll have your closet back to you in an hour. Thanks, friend, helped out." "I don't care." "I have to change," Emily told her savior. She thought to herself, he's nothing like our local guys. Clean, neat, polite. Not like Greg and her high school boyfriend. Shirt always open, dirty pants, all stained, cigarette in the corner of his thin, predatory lips. What kind of a groom is he? In vain they were already matched with each other in the village. "No offense, but my favorite Max refused my offer to dine with me," Vincent said. "I'll hand you over to your village doctor. Then we'll go." That's a fine word. Aesculapius, Emily thought, at a loss. One must keep one's ear to the ground with these city folk. Always they have words abstruse, quotations from books, and she had never held other printed editions in her hands, except for fiction from the school curriculum and a large colorful book in the world of fauna and flora. After that book, and she had a dream to become a biologist and study the animal world. But for the time being, these bright prospects were pushed away from her for a whole year because of the unfortunate bronchitis. They walked in silence to the nurse's station. Vincent didn't ask her any questions, seeing that she occasionally wrinkled her nose in pain. The paramedic in the office praised the man who'd been next to the injured waitress. "Look how skillfully the wound is treated. Who was able to do it so clearly?" "I did the best I could, without false modesty," Vincent announced. "I come from a family of hereditary surgeons. My father, mother, grandfather, it's as if they were all born with a scalpel in their hands. It would be foolish for me not to have basic first aid skills." After handing Emily over to the medical officer as promised, the boy bowed courteously and disappeared out the door. Emily could only look at him with annoyance and conclude that such a man would not make a long acquaintance with a village girl. Not to her liking, even if his eyes were as blue as lakes. Too refined, urban. A prince from a fairy tale read to them as a child by a kindergarten teacher. He wouldn't follow his princess to the dining room door in a carriage. Emily was wrong. The next day, the first person she saw outside the dining room was Vincent. He greeted her again with his impossibly warm smile and said, "I have the day off after 3 shifts at Bachton. Why don't I help you set the tables? Your arm's in bandages. It's early. I don't think it stopped hurting. We can do it better together. Then we'll go to the movies. They're showing an old comedy at the club today. Ivan Vasilievich changes profession. Have you seen that movie before?" Emily's feet had been knocked off the ground. She's not the one being greeted by a real knight in the cafeteria. She's not the one called to the movies after work, or offered to help with trays, forks, and spoons. It couldn't be, because it could never be. But it was happening in real life. Vincent didn't seem at all intent on hiding his obvious interest in her. Emily banished the memories that had come flooding back to her after fiddling with the string of pickle jars. She sat Ellen down at the table in a soft blanket, so that she could finally end the day with some aromatic herbal tea. Summer was soon rolling smoothly into its second half. Time fled, not as it had in her youth, stretching like sweet molasses. Annoyed, Ellen asked to go to bed after tea. It was time for her to go to bed herself. She had grand plans for this summer's warmth and pickles, so long as there were no problems. She'd pack up some presents for New Year's Eve in the fall. It was unlikely that she would be able to get out to the city before then. The last thoughts of the woman had already sunk into a blissful sleep. Tomorrow is a new day and new worries. Emily was a good hostess. What she could not cook from the gifts of the vegetable garden and the garden. It was her and Mama Ellen's house that was old and dilapidated, and everything that grew on the ground and in the ground always succeeded to the glory. Having finished the epic with cucumbers, she switched to caviar from zucchini or juice, which she cooked from all the fruits ripening on the trees. It was her turn to put the tomatoes in jars. Then to cut apricots, apples, plums, and pears into large slices and send them to sunbathe on metal sheets under the sun. My son has always respected dried fruit compote. He could make it himself at home in the city. It was a simple matter. Emily looked down at the sacks of potatoes, at the makeshift nets made of old stockings and stuffed with golden onions, and sighed. Though she still seemed to have the strength to carry all this wealth into town herself. Would she have to go to Greg again? He'll start his chatter. "I've been waiting 30 years for you to marry me. I'll give up the gorilla and the vodka. You know me." She'll smoke all the way to the cabin. I can't breathe. Yeah, pelting her with salty jokes and lewd innuendos. He just won't let it go, the old dog. Long married, 3 grown-up children, grandchildren already. And he keeps looking questioningly into her eyes, as if he wants to read something in them. Don't believe that first high school love never rusts. Since she was young, Greg had been her eternal sighing partner. But he never got anything. One thing's for sure, if she asks him to drive his truck to Archie's, he'll never say no. By the morning of December 25th, a blizzard was brewing. Emily had already arranged with her neighbor Maggie to look after 2 or 3 bags for Archie. Emily had packed such bulky bags that faithful Greg only shouted when he saw them on the doorstep. "Be thankful my heart is heavy for you. No fool would have agreed to haul all that stuff into town on our dirt road to the highway. Only my iron horse can do it with 4-wheel drive and off-road capabilities. Would you haul your bags to the bag on a motorcycle? Emily, I wouldn't be so nice to you." Emily hurriedly slipped him a pre-prepared bottle of her famous Naluka made from all the seasonal fruits and berries. The secret of this strong elixir was simple. Whatever fruit or berry was ripe, they were poured in a layer on the bottom of a 10-liter container up to half, covered with sugar, then the next layer of ripe fruit, and so on until the last autumn harvest of frost-resistant berries. We let it insist for 21 days, picked, separating from the rest of the fruit and berries, and then topped up with vodka from the village store for residual disinfection. The result was a drink of unprecedented flavor. The whole village was waiting for Emily and Ellen to treat them to this gift. Greg pushed the bag of money away. He grabbed Emily's hand. "There is no such gift. I have been waiting for so many years from you, my grandmother. You are alone. A century. You are not a stone, Emily, nor ice. I can't believe you're still faithful to your first love. It doesn't work like that." Emily shoved Greg away in her heart and gritted her teeth. "You can be the only man on this planet. I'll never be yours. You hear me, Greg? You don't know what it's like." "All your life one man remember to love?" Greg asked. "How many times have you and I already brought up this subject? I consider you a friend, not by way of a hitchhiker, a heavy drinker, but not evil. But why are you playing that song again? We shouldn't pick sweet berries together, but bitter berries. I cut everything off without you a long time ago. Even the idea of starting the car. It's going to snow soon. And you still have to get back to the village by daylight. The days are so short, it'll be dark before you know it." Archie was in high spirits this morning. The New Year's Eve party at his firm had been timed to coincide with Catholic Christmas. On this occasion, this Saturday was rented a nice cozy cafe near their office. Since some time ago, a new female employee from the marketing department has been actively making eyes at him. Tonight, he would invite her to his house after the party for a cup of coffee. Archie sighed dreamily and mentally assured himself, "Chicks like me. I change them like worn-out gloves that don't fit into the last closet." This young lady will not resist, he was sure of his complete male irresistibility. So look, and New Year's vacations he and this person will spend together. Someone has to make Olivier salad for the festive table, and finally to put in order in his bachelor's den. Pretty face and appetizing figure of the new girl will be an additional prize. He'd already broken up with his ex-girlfriend 2 weeks ago. It was time to find her a worthy replacement from those who are not puzzled by complexes. He won't be dragged to the registry office. The redhead from the neighboring department was definitely from this carefree cohort of girls. Winter celebrations promised a lot of pleasant surprises. Coming out of the shower in only a towel, Archie heard a knock at the door. He hurried to open it. "Mom, what are you doing here in town?" he wondered. "I wasn't expecting you. You're in the wrong place today." For some reason, Emily was immediately confused by the cold reception. She wanted to hug her son. She missed him. On the diplomat in her hands, but he squeamishly removed her hands. "You should warn me about your unexpected visits," Archie said. "I might have other plans for the near future. And now you're here. How did you manage to surprise me? What are you dragging across the threshold? Look at your wet footprints on the floor." The events that followed seemed like a bad dream to Emily for a long time afterward. Archie angrily kicked the sack of potatoes, pushed aside the bag of onions, lovingly packed by his mother in a plastic bag so that they wouldn't get wet. With annoyance, he settled down on a large bag with pickles. "How could you think, Mother, that I was starving here? There's a supermarket around the corner. The shelves are full of goods." "I tried to get you some things for the winter holidays," Emily said. "Archie's used to all his own, homemade, natural." "Don't be such a country bumpkin," Archie said angrily. "I've been a city dweller for a long time, and I live by the rules of a big metropolis. I'm not going to waste time on your culinary riches. Pack all this stuff back up, and next time you'll give me a little more notice of your visit. I don't need a mother hen mooching over me like a little chicken. I think you have an old friend in town who's lonely. Go to her with all these presents. Make the old lady happy with a New Year's offering." The young man grabbed the grocery bags and started carrying them out to the entrance, without letting his mother enter the apartment, without at least offering to warm herself with tea. Emily couldn't believe this wasn't happening to her. Her son couldn't do this to her. What evil spells had this town put him under? The truck is probably already out of town and headed for home. She hadn't corresponded with her city friend in over a year. How to know if it was possible to visit her now, or would she also give her the runaround? The snowstorm was getting worse outside. The snow was falling not in large fluffy snowflakes, but in a sharp and chopping way. It was too early to reveal a face uncovered by clothes and headdresses. Archie, meanwhile, carried all his mother's presents out into the empty yard. The yard glistened in this weather, and darkness was slowly descending on Chicago, which liked to come early in the cold season. "I called a cab for you," Archie said. "I hope you remember your high school buddy's address clearly. I've wasted so much time with you. I've got to get cleaned up for the New Year's Eve party. You should know that. I'm going through some changes in my personal life. There's nothing for you to do here in Chicago anytime soon. I'll be fine on my own. I'm going to be 30 years old in April. I don't need your pesky tutelage anymore." A young guy came to the call, fussily began to put food supplies in the trunk, all the time looking back at the angry man, and for some reason the woman, who was writhing in pain, even thought to himself, there's something wrong between them. He is saying something to her. She looks pitifully and covers her face with her palm. But it's none of my business. I'll fulfill the order and go on my way. New Year's Eve and the vacations themselves, if you try for a couple of months. Then, until spring will feed me. Emily got into the car without looking back. It was so unbearably painful, as if something bright, always warming her soul, had been doused with viscous, stinking marsh mud. No bath gels and foams could wash it away. No bath gels and foams could drown out the vile odor of her soul's decay. She always bought in the store all these fragrant accessories for bathing, to pamper, to please Helene. The old woman was always delighted to smell them at home. But here, in this case, the vibes of the subtle odors were unable to remove that blackness. She only relaxed when she climbed into the back seat. The tears came in streams. There was no stopping their rapid flow. Though she didn't like to show weakness in public, she couldn't hold back. The driver asked her sympathetically, "Where are we going, lady?" The answer shocked him. "You can throw me out in a clear field," Emily said. "My son didn't even ask if I had the money to pay you for the job. Prices are different in the city. I don't have enough cash reserves for a long trip. You know," she suddenly became lively, "I can pay you back with village products. I have excellent potatoes, some onions, cylinders with cucumbers, and tomatoes from my own beds. Will that pay?" This cab driver had seen a lot of things in his 2 years in Chicago, but he had never read such hopeless sorrow in anyone's eyes. It's like she just gave up a living son. He was now taking this woman to nowhere. And it felt like she'd just buried him. It didn't take him long to make up his mind, but soon he said, "Why do we need your gifts, Ma Am? Can't we find a plate of pilaf and a cup of hot tea for a good man?" "What if I'm bad?" Emily asked. "Come on, I'm not kidding. I have a good eye. I can always tell an honest and kind heart from a bad and deceitful one. I'm going to bring you back to my house. Don't be afraid of anything around me." Emily didn't have many highlights in her life, except a few trips with Archie to the sea and those happy times when they were so attached to each other. Once they arrived in sunny Miami, they both immediately fell in love with this southern land with azure sea, sand dunes, the cries of seagulls, daring dolphins swimming directly to the shore. Then, after high school, Archie graduated from a technical university in Chicago, and so there in the dormitory at first and stayed. He didn't make such a brilliant career, but his income was enough for his current expenses. Then I rented a cozy 2-room apartment almost in the center. He spent a lot of time in the company of student friends, and then colleagues. Emily soberly realized that a grown-up young man cannot keep near the mother's skirt. In her hometown in the last 2 or 3 years, he no longer visited. Emily didn't own any modern gadgets. All communication was through an old button cell phone. Archie called her no more than once or twice a month, reducing communication to brief questions and answers. And the connection in her backwoods town was stable, but in bad weather it failed. Their estrangement from each other was probably inevitable. But why did it hurt so much today then? Emily visited her son every year under the New Year's holiday with country guests. His current reaction had put her in a stupor. Or had something seriously changed in Archie's soul in this tough town? She hadn't noticed. Only questions were bouncing around in her head right now, and there were no answers. The silent cab driver drove her to the outskirts of Chicago to one of the houses that used to be solidly inhabited by tenants of communal apartments. She was not mistaken one of those huge apartments with many doors opening into a hallway and an impressive kitchen. She and a young boy had entered. At first she was confused. Within the walls of this apartment lived a whole Tabor, which now spilled out of all the rooms to consider the unexpected guest. There was a speech she did not understand, but there was no aggression in its tone. The fellow cab driver stopped all debate in a flash. A couple minutes later, she was ushered into an empty room with a small sofa, a coffee table, and an old TV on a dresser, rugs with national ornaments on the walls and floor. Women with smiles handed her a set of bed linens, a large blanket, terry towels, and house slippers. Brand new, Emily somehow immediately warmed in that welcoming warmth. After a couple minutes, she caught up. "Please, let's get my supplies from the trunk. Not as payment for your help, not for your wonderful hospitality, just for fun. In them and every potato, cucumber, tomato, a part of my soul. I really want you to feel it." Having consulted among themselves, the residents of the apartment sent a whole delegation to the car, while the cab driver hurriedly snacked on something in the kitchen. An hour later, when her savior, who had been driving all day to feed his family, had long since disappeared in the blizzard, Emily was called into the kitchen. She went in and marveled. There were so many people at the big long table that her eyes were scattered. She thought, what a friendly people. They can't all be members of the same family. At the head of the table sat an elderly woman. Further along the perimeter, younger people. Many children. The men in this tribe from Central Asia were almost all still at work. Their bread in a foreign land was certainly not easy. Emily realized that local traditions and long-established household rituals were familiar from childhood. How difficult it was for these people from distant lands to accept the rules imposed on them and survive in an unfamiliar reality. A leisurely dinner began. The hearty meal was crowned by a large cast iron with a scattering of pilaf, which everyone at the table, as soon as they got a plate in their hands, neatly and skillfully ate directly with their hands. Next to the pilaf was a pile of boiled potatoes sprinkled with coarse salt, which for some reason did not dissolve in the moist steam. Everywhere around the edges were containers of Emily's pickles. One of the young women picked up a green cucumber and took a bite. The other women followed her example, and soon they were clucking approvingly, giving the master a thumbs up in approval. What a strange day it is, Emily thought after dinner. It's only 9 p.m. and already my eyes are traitorously slipping. Not a single person at the table asked her a single question, as if she'd been living with them for 1,000 years. The nearest neighbor then showed her where the bathroom was and escorted her to her temporary abode. Amazing, the woman stated. I don't remember Archie at all. The thread that ties us together, like the umbilical cord between a newborn baby and its mommy, has been severed. The hurt and all the memories associated with him seem to have fallen into the abyss of timelessness. Emily's mind was nothing but a viscous porridge that had had too much water poured into it when boiling. She fell asleep with her head barely touching the pillow. Earlier they had arranged with the cab driver, who had become her good wizard for the evening, that by 6 a.m. he would take her to the bus station for the first bus toward their village. It would be a full 4 hours on the highway to get home. Then, if she was lucky, a hitchhiker. Another half an hour on a dirt road to their village. The district administration promises that the road to their village will be asphalted, but they have been waiting 3 years for the promise. They had been living without a normal road for 30 years. That was the last thing Emily had time to think about before falling into a restful sleep. In the morning, the woman got up so cheerful that she surprised herself. Not a drop of despair after her son's treacherous stab in the back yesterday. Her soul was at peace. Yes, it was all on the doorstep of Archie's apartment. But it was as if the emotion had vanished. No grief, no sadness, no longing. A large cup of coffee and a fresh scone with cheese were waiting for her in the kitchen. One of the older women was carefully placing the same scones in a paper bag for her, gesturing that it was for the road. In her other hand, she held a clear plastic bag containing her jacket, shoved it embarrassedly into Emily's hands, and disappeared behind one of the doors. The cab driver from yesterday came up. "Well, Mother? Did you have some fun with my relatives?" "No. They don't speak Russian very well yet. It was my mother who taught Russian at school in the town of Kant in Uzbekistan. That's why I'm so quick to communicate. She died of a serious illness when she was very young. Since then, I want to help every woman who is old enough to be my mother in some way. I won't hurt the young ones either. Why should I? But I try to be especially attentive to the older ones. I didn't have time to give them everything I didn't give my mother. I missed it. Your son will regret what he did. Yesterday 100 times over. He and I are about the same age, but he hasn't matured into true manly wisdom. They'll come crawling back to you on their knees. You'll remember my words later, but now let's hurry or we'll miss your bus." After the blizzard of yesterday, the city was frozen in snow-white silence. There was hardly a soul on the streets. Only lonely passers-by were hurrying somewhere to go about their business. At such an early hour, it was not even dawn. The sky only turned a pink haze. After gathering her things, nothing else was weighing on her hands. Home to Mama Ellen's house. She missed their home and her mother's caressing hands terribly. Walking lightly to the bus with 2 small bags was almost a pleasure. Emily bought a ticket for the first row of seats and climbed into the bus, which was already under steam and waiting for passengers to see her off. The cab driver waved goodbye once more, and she was suddenly so eager to remember her first and only love that she barely waited until everyone else had taken their seats. No one had bought a ticket next to her. She cozied up in 2 seats at once and plunged into the memories of 30 years ago. The love story of each couple is different. One has fatal passion simmering. The other has a craving for romance off the charts. The third duo builds relationships, as in the tragedies of Shakespeare. If you try to characterize the love of Emily and Vincent in one word, then the most suitable definition is pure mutual love at first sight. He'd noticed her, the girl staring helplessly at the piece of glass sticking out of her hand. She heaved with happiness the moment there was a cracking sound as he tore his cotton shirt into bandages. Their worlds were different. He came from a family of hereditary medical intellectuals. She is the daughter of Matthew and Ellen, born and raised in poverty by the Russian soil and post-war collective farms. Their points of contact were few. But does love ask whose hands to weave together? After the day, Vince and Emily had spent all day setting tables side by side in the cafeteria for the students, and then laughing their asses off watching a comedy at the club. They were hardly different. Here's the revised text. It was as if they were glued to each other with glue. While Emily flew into the dining room with a tray in anticipation of her evening date, Vince carefully stacked the watermelons and melons in the truck, then hurried off, never lingering anywhere. People were running toward him. In their endless conversations, they sometimes got lost and misunderstood each other. Emily would tell how her parents ran to the farm at night. The calf could not come into the world, completely tortured the mother cow, and Vince would ask with a frothing at the mouth whether she had read The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Vince's family has only had this great novel, printed in a limited edition in 1973, for 3 days. So he and his parents didn't eat or sleep for 3 days in order to have time to read the literary masterpiece. What Pontius Pilate? Who is Woland? Who are the master and Margarita? Emily thought fearfully. I am so far from all this new stuff. Gently he took the girl by the hand and led her away to a club for dancing, a movie, or just wandering around the neighborhood. Not a hint of intimacy, just endless admiration. A hive that could not be played. Time inexorably flew forward. The days flashed by. Soon the students had to leave for the city. Emily and Vince were oblivious to their surroundings, lost in the marvelous gift of heaven, their first true love. Neither of them had any previous experience with the opposite sex. Vince, contrary to his parents' dreams, was not going to follow the path of a doctor, but was delirious with formulas, integrals and derivatives, the mysteries of theoretical mathematics. That's why he entered a technical university, not a medical school after school. He was not fond of girls, neither at school nor on the student bench. Once at the age of 15, he seemed to fall in love with a girl next to him. But tricksy, quiet, intelligent classmate attention did not complain. He wrote all the notes in class to the loser. She made eyes at him, waited faithfully for her idol after class on the sports field behind the school building. Vince's feelings waned. He's back to his sine qua non. Emily had more of his love lyrics in her life. Her faithful knight, henchman, admirer Greg had kept her busy since 5th grade. He pulled her thick braid mercilessly, demanded that she write her homework regularly. In the 8th grade, tried to kiss at the New Year's Eve party, but Amy guessed his intentions, prudently washed away from the school ball. As soon as Greg went outside to smoke with the boys, she was gone. Now Vince and Emily were lucky that the girl's boyfriend wasn't in the village. He had gone to the sea with his parents for 2 months. His mother, on occasion a cook, in the pioneer camp from the regional factory, got a job for the hot season. His father, mentor in the circle of skillful hands. There, too, got a job. But they had been on some kind of shift positions before. No one in the village was surprised by their absence this time. Emily's parents noticed that her daughter does not walk, but flies above the ground, but did not interfere in her personal life. The mother only told her daughter, be careful. These good city boys are of a different mold, not like our country boys, who have what's on their minds, what's in their actions. Don't be afraid for me, Mommy. He's the best. He won't even lay a finger on me. We talk more and more. Yeah, we look at the stars at night. Naive thoughts. Who could beat Mother Nature and instincts? The last night before Vince left for home, he'd been so desperate to keep his hand in hers, so affectionate in Amy's eyes, that she couldn't understand what had come over her, what sweet eclipse had pushed her to do it. She rose up on her tiptoes and nestled her soft lips against Vince's, still smelling of the watermelon they'd just eaten together. The guy staggered back, wrapped his arms around the girl's shoulders, nuzzled his nose into the top of her head. Fire me. Don't provoke me. I haven't touched you on purpose all this time, love. I'm afraid if I touch you, I won't be able to stop. And I have to leave tomorrow. Who knows what lies ahead? And without stopping, Amy whispered into his ear. It's my decision. I trust you completely. Vince hadn't expected such boldness. In his 19 years, he hadn't yet known women. But he'd curiously perused the theory in his parents' manuals a long time ago. There was not an ounce of awkwardness, fear of seeming like an inexperienced novice. Of course, he had long dreamed of intimacy with Amy, but he was afraid of offending her, and, in order not to lose his temper, deliberately did not even go to kisses, longer than on the cheek, to say goodbye, too dear to her, too careful of her honor, too respectful. There is such a reverent attitude to the object of his worship. Not all young men devise strategies and tactics to get their girlfriend into bed as quickly as possible. Back home, Vince intended to announce to his parents that he'd met the love of his life. This year he would travel to the village to visit Amy. Then she'd go to college and move closer to him in the city. When the time comes, they'll get married. The girl was too young to break her destiny. Love had decided everything for both of them. They couldn't resist, they couldn't delay. Amy had no regrets. Vince was over the moon. Later at night, after their shy, naive lovemaking, right in the field, amidst the flower buds swarming approvingly on a soft carpet of lush green grasses, they lay hugging each other for a long time, dreaming of the future. They would certainly have a family, certainly 3 children. They would have their own cozy nest somewhere in the city. And in the summer they would come to her parents in the village to be once again in the place where they were connected by this dark blue night, with twinkling distant stars. In the morning, a service bus came to pick up the students. They parted easily, with the firm assurance that the next weekend Vince would come to visit his beloved. Vince never arrived. He was gone. Amy hadn't realized that his parents were at home with suitcases, sharing the news. Son, we're so excited. Dad was appointed director of a huge surgery center in the Far East. It's a modern complex. All the equipment there is state-of-the-art. The best specialists from all over the country are gathered under its roof. It's a great privilege to work there. We've already learned everything. There's also a state university nearby with the same mechanical and mathematical faculty as yours. We're flying out the day after tomorrow. Vince turned pale. What are we going to do? We made a deal with Amy. Daily correspondence by mail for now. I left her my address and hers. I promised to write to her on demand. She'll freak out if I suddenly disappear. After dinner, Vince told his mother that he had met an extraordinary girl in the village, that he was in love with her, and that he missed her. The only thing he'd withheld was the fact that he and Amy were close. Having listened to the attuned offspring, the wise woman immediately solved his problem. Went to a neighbor in the stairwell, with whom she was very friendly, and agreed that all correspondence coming to their address, she will immediately send them to the Far East. When she returned, she told her son about the way out of the situation. I thought to myself, I will later return to this issue. If I realize that our boy is really seriously attracted to that stranger. Otherwise he will have new friends, fellow students, new interests, and new girls. Life itself will put everything in its place. All that happened in Vince's family more than 30 years ago, Amy, of course, did not know. She herself, before she could even see the boy off on the bus, had rushed straight home to try out her pen in epistolary style. Yesterday's schoolgirl was not very good at it. She was afraid to write something stupid, so she decided that she would tell her lover on paper how her every day was going. The first pancake is always a pancake. Amy found it very difficult to write a few lines. By the time she delivered it to the post office a day later in a brightly colored envelope with hearts on it, Vince and his parents were boarding a plane at the airport. 10 hours into the flight, the airliner landed at the airport. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky was almost a stone's throw away. They would find themselves on the Pacific coast in Avaka Bay, which prepared for them a picturesque land. Vince. The parents are a young man himself. Amy, Matthew, and Ellen could not even think that a gray cardinal would interfere in the fate of 2 hearts in love. Vince's neighbor from the family across the hall. The reason is mundane. But it is this small trifle managed to forever turn the fate of the 2 families, putting their lives on a completely different track. The fact is that the neighbor had a very young daughter who had long been in love with Vince. She had already tortured her mother with dreams that when she grew up, she would become Vince's fiancée, his wife. Her mother, who herself had raised the now 13-year-old girl without a father, looked at the family of successful doctors with a distant eye toward a future in breeding. It's nothing that they have now gone to Kamchatka for a long ruble. They left the apartment in her care. They didn't even rent it to anyone. She's been trying for years to placate, to please, to inspire trust, to bake a couple of hearty cabbage pies. One for the neighbor, the doctor's ears. That, with their eternal operations, duty when his family night masterpiece is to pamper. Boil strawberry jam, half of the jars again to the neighbor dear. She has a whole strawberry bushes on the dacha. Well, it is not difficult for her to share with nice people. So, offerings, good-naturedness, questions and participation, and tamed the family of surgeons. She had no time to look into their souls. When she took out the first letter from Amy with bright red hearts on the envelope, she didn't send it anywhere. She hid it in a candy box. Let it wait for its time. The rest of the masterpieces in epistolary style from the girl in love also went there. For the first time, she dared to open a message when the hearts on it were black. Who had failed to do so? It had been 3 months since the neighbors had left for distant lands. Vince's mother pelted the neighbor with questions over the phone. Has anything come for your son? The wily woman held her ground. Anything that came in your name. I dutifully sent to you. Immediately nothing else appeared in your mailbox. Presently she held above the steam this last grim, as she called it to herself, envelope. The letter stirred. It contained only a couple of lines. Vince, I can't keep quiet any longer. I'm pregnant. I'm still keeping it from my parents. But if you don't answer my cry for help, I'm going to go tell them my problem. The mother of a teenage daughter in love, pining for Vince, could not help but destroy such a letter in favor of the love of the young man and his mysterious village girlfriend. Knowing the intelligence of this all-medical family, she had no doubt they would not abandon the girl who had gotten their son pregnant to her fate. Not one, even the smallest, remorse did not arise in the soul of the loving mother when she set the ill-fated letter on fire over the flame of the gas stove in the kitchen. It's all right that the paper burned her fingers a little. No wedding, Vince. With another special way bred and grief herself, and the consequences of her promiscuity. Ellen did not regard the fact of the love child's coming into the world as a nuisance or grief. She was still insanely credulous, ecstatically waiting for any word from Vince. She justified his silence in every way she could, invented 1,000 explanations for why her beloved had not yet responded to her letters. When there was no point in hiding her situation from her parents, Ellen told Matthew and Ellen the truth, that she had no regrets, that she loved Vince more than her life, that she had wanted them to be close. There was no scolding, no anger, no bewilderment on the part of her elders. Mama Ellen put her small but strong arms around her. She looked into her eyes and read something in them that she alone knew. Then she said, as she stamped each word, if your city beau has evaporated forever, it's here without him. Evil tongues in the village do not listen. Big, true love is not given to everyone by fate. People will envy your happiness. And a child from the one you love, isn't that happiness? Remember. My dear, if the heavens gave you a child after your close encounter, it means that your deed was approved by the Lord God Himself. Look at the world with joyful eyes. Give birth. And grandmother and I will always be there for you. The news that Helen would soon become a young mother could not be kept secret in the village for long. Greg, who had returned from the seas, was furious. He even tried to scandalize Ellen. Caught her in the street, so that's what girl did not give a horn. I turn away from the gate. And with the other had time to tumble. The impregnable fortress fell quickly. Or have you always been such a girl? And me just for fun? Ellen tried to walk past the guy throwing angry accusations, but he suddenly rushed to her and frantically began to beg, you don't listen to me. My jealousy has taken root. If it happens that your sweetheart doesn't come back to you, I'll marry you and we'll raise your baby together. Yugi was surprised by such a statement from her longtime admirer. Knowing his tough temper, she didn't believe a word he said. Vince alone held her feminine heart. Looking at Greg, the expression shameful became clear. Her heart grew cold at the sight of Greg. It became icy cold. She wanted to run away at once. She didn't tell the boy about the frost inside her. She thanked him dryly for his offer to be together. Resolutely replied that it was impossible. That dialogue somehow became the last straw in her agonizing wait for Vince. It's a sad story of life's twists and turns and the mistakes of youth. When Yuji came home, a letter flew into town without any hearts on the envelope. Hello, Vince. Today I've decided to marry someone else. You are far away. He is always there. I don't see a future with you anymore. Goodbye, our love. I was probably just dreaming. Greg is reliable and faithful to me, which is something I value pricelessly in him. It wasn't Yugi's hand that was stroking the piece of paper. It was resentment, bitterness, and disappointment that whispered in her ear that she should write something derogatory, contemptuous, and cruel to her lover in retaliation. But Yugi still wouldn't sling mud, retaliate, reprimand. There's such an expression, not fate. She thought it was just such a case. The ubiquitous neighbor, who was assigned to send the mail, could not believe her luck. Thoughts fluttered around in her head like birds. The girl's heart couldn't take it. She still turned on the back, gave up Vince. And that's all me and my daughter want. This letter of hers I will send to the Far East with great pleasure. But her devious plans were not destined to come true. It is not for nothing that people talk about boomerangs. It caught up with her after that despicable act. In love with Vince, young lady in graduate school sharply changed priorities, fell into a bad company, fond of medicines. The mother of a classmate worked in a pharmacy. The boy, left there alone, began to understand the pills. And here the fashion went, and without a prescription they could get them. Alas, the mistakes of youth turned into a great tragedy for all participants in this story. What a pity that misunderstanding and intrigue separated two loving people. Their happiness was so close. Young people did not miss this opportunity. Once, betting on weakness, as I and the whole company decided to try a novelty. The guys drank the medicine in handfuls. Couldn't get the neighbor's daughter out of there. After the funeral, no consolation. The mother didn't last long. Why live if the only beloved blood daughter went to heaven prematurely, she thought. God was even more cruel to her, did not give her a quick demise, deprived her of reason. Only her nephew, the seventh water on the vine, remained among her relatives. Is he going to take care of an abnormal aunt, having registered guardianship over her? Quickly dumped a woman aged from grief in a specialized clinic, and rented the apartment to temporary tenants until then. Disassembling things in the house before the arrival of tenants, all the paraphernalia like old cardboard boxes and other unnecessary junk, he took to the trash cans. That's where the candy box with Vince's letters to Emily went too. Now there's no trace of their once great love. The last evidence of the story had faded into oblivion. In early June, as it was due, Emily had a son. The family named the boy Archie. A sturdy, healthy, smiling, actively growing son, and gave cheek. Grandfather Matthew and grandmother Helen on the price of the soul did not tea. Mama Emily idolized the boy. In each of his features found a resemblance to his favorite. Childhood, like all the kids in the village fields and meadows with variety, vegetables and fruits in the garden and in the vegetable garden. Favorite river with cool water. The animal world in all yards with cows, bird kingdom, frisky cats. Everyone tried not to even hint about Vince's daddy, realizing that his daughter's heart was still aching, and still washed at night with secret tears of her first love. Vince was welcomed at the University of Texas with open arms. His transcript was full of excellent grades. His knowledge was at a high level. Very soon he was able to dive back into his favorite formulas. At first he waited for letters from Emily with such greed and impatience that his father and mother even feared a little for his mental health. Then there was a period of supposed calm. Vince didn't ask about news from his hometown, and his parents avoided the subject. The letter was a verdict on the village affair, and Vince took it a little strangely. It was as if he'd been expecting something like this, ready for it. He didn't want to share the heartbreak with his parents. The energy was boiling, the frustration inside. He evaluated the events himself, but he didn't voice it. However, youth, new discoveries, new places, new acquaintances took their toll. Gradually, it began to seem to him that he had made it all up. A field with soft grass, the scents of flowers, the greedy lips of his beloved, the sparkle in her eyes. Maybe everyone's first experience leaves such vivid emotions. And in reality, everything was not so romantic. Somewhere in his heart there were echoes of memories, and then they faded into a dreamlike haze, like a fairy tale set against the backdrop of the countryside. Vince had given himself fully to science and had excelled in it. Even before he graduated, a prestigious foreign magazine published a small monograph on the application of certain mathematical formulas to industry. The graduate student mastered the English language perfectly unthinkable for the mid-90s in Russia. The young mathematician was seriously interested in Great Britain and the USA. A year after defending his diploma, Vincent was offered a long internship at an American university. After consulting with his parents, he agreed. On the personal front, the technician-mathematician, who showed great promise, was not at all a reclusive monk. He had affairs with fellow students, did not ignore sparkling parties, easily made unburdensome connections with women. His heart was silent, and sometimes he couldn't even remember their names. Vince traveled to the United States alone, and there he suddenly fell in love. His romance with Maggie, a bright brunette wife from Florida who studied psychology at the same university where he was assigned to lecture, was like a tsunami, a typhoon, a love whirlwind, a tornado. When Vince was offered a contract for another 5 years, he accepted enthusiastically. Maggie finished her studies and finally moved in with him on campus, where he was assigned an office cottage with a large emerald lawn at the entrance and a swimming pool in the backyard. Maggie had only one major disadvantage for health reasons. She couldn't have children. That had bothered Vince at first, but then he'd come to terms with it. He loved the woman with a strange, morbid affection. After the modest wedding, little had changed in their union. Vincent still worked night and day on his mathematics. His wife chose to become a housewife. After his successful university work and marriage, Vince became a resident of this Western country. He had not been to Russia for many years. Modern gadgets now allowed him to communicate with the sight of his relatives on a large computer screen. His restless parents wouldn't part with medicine for an hour, even to visit him and his daughter-in-law. Vince and Maggie traveled extensively on the rare days they were free from work. His royalties were getting larger and larger on the basis of the unusual developments he had made. There was already much being implemented in industrial sectors and even in the space field. The essence of his work was so complex that only specialists understood it, and Vince couldn't stop working on new problems. If he had been asked what his life in America was like, he would have said, without hesitation, that it was happy and serene. It seemed that this prosperous era would be endless. But to whom does fate allocate only white joyful stripes? The black ink of sorrow spilled onto the whiteness. After 17 years of happy married life, Maggie unexpectedly fell in love with a young scientist-physicist who arrived, as her husband once arrived in the United States from Latin America for training. The man was unusually good-looking, a fiery mixture of southern blood, penetrating eyes, inquisitive gaze, luxurious curly hair. There was something of blue-blooded aristocrat and macho in his appearance at the same time. He wore his clothes with such elegance on his athletic figure that one could guess the graceful movements of a strong leopard. The female students in his lectures heard nothing of what he was trying to teach them, but only watched him like a hypnotist and a boa constrictor. Jinnah and the newly arrived scientist first crossed paths at a Thanksgiving party. November was chilly that year. The woman, all the while wrapped in a fashionable fur jacket over her evening gown, was saving herself with another shot of whiskey to keep warm. She picked up the glass with the hot drink and reached for the tongs to add ice to the drink. It was at that moment that she encountered the burning eyes of a dark-haired man with striking good looks. They say love is chemistry. The molecules of two bodies and souls collide in the air. Some catalyst intervenes and it's done. That's what happened for Maggie and her new object of attention. They left the party together. The woman didn't care what her husband thought about it. Maggie did not hide the protracted love affair, which became a rope between the two hearts, from Vincent. "I don't care what happens tomorrow, darling. Today I'm madly in love and also madly happy. You don't deserve deception on my part, so I'm saying all of this to your face. Accept it and forgive me. It just happened," she said succinctly. Vince listened to his wife calmly. He had already guessed what was going on and was unsurprised by his reaction. The painful agony of the beginning of their relationship was gone. By and large, he did not care where and with whom his wife spends time. Their love had exhausted itself. Even the warmth was almost gone, just a tribute to the years they had spent together. Nothing more. He suddenly had a sudden urge to leave everything in this distant country, which had never really become his native country, and return to Russia to his parents. But the laws did not allow him to disappear overnight after his divorce from his wife. He was still bound by certain obligations with the university. Some scientific developments continued, and lectures went on as usual. It was necessary to solve issues with real estate and other property, earned over years of hard work as a specialist of his level. The government and the company he worked for paid generously. Vince had amassed a considerable amount of capital that could help him start from scratch back home. It took him 2 seemingly endless years to resolve all the legal issues. Of course, during his stay there, he went to Russia several times to see his parents in person, but he never traveled further than the Far East. Now he wanted to travel to the places of his childhood, youth, and student years. The plans were grandiose. And then there was a meeting with his classmates in his hometown. He really wanted to take an active part in it. Archie's New Year's Eve romance, which had almost been ruined by his mother's sudden arrival with suitcases, had been a stormy and memorable one. Mandy was amazing. She had only one drawback: she was constantly, like a powerful vacuum cleaner, pulling out all of Archie's earnings. After a couple of months, it became clear that not only salaries and advances, but also rainy day reserves were flying into the wind. And Mandy kept saying, "Kitty, you're so cool. Buy me that purse that drove me crazy at the mall." Her mistress didn't want to do any of the housework. They ordered food from restaurants all the time. Cleaning the apartment once a week had to be done by a cleaning company. Inside Archie began to grow a deafening irritation. But it was not so easy to get rid of the mistress who loved broad gestures. By the May holidays, she broke the news to him that she was pregnant. She talked about a stamp in the passport, a fashionable wedding dress from the latest collection, and necessarily diamonds and small ears, so that all her friends collapsed from envy. Marriage wasn't exactly in Archie's plans. He was visibly successful. At this time, his companion was sitting with her friends at the bar and sharing her plans for the near future. "Girls, another sucker has fallen for my bait. I have already told him the fairy tale that we will have a child. Now he's looking for a way out, and I have the next trump card up my sleeve. I'll tell him I'm ready to get rid of the baby. How would he know that after the first abortion I probably won't have children? And I'm a child-free person myself. I don't need cute babies screaming in diapers. Aren't you afraid that one of your men will figure out your pregnancy adventure?" one of her friends asked, stirring her cocktail with a bright red plastic straw. "What are you talking about?" the experienced schemer grinned. "Most modern men are so afraid of the legal marriage stamp in their passports that they rush to count the payoffs for their freedom." Archie, meanwhile, was running through his head a combination of how to pull off a deal on behalf of his company and get a big kickback for services from the suppliers. He had no experience with commercial subterfuge. But that was okay, he could handle it. The main thing is that the preparation of this contract was entrusted to him. There was one thing the man hadn't considered. His boss was a clever businessman. He noticed the greedy gleam in his subordinate's eyes when talking about a new equipment purchase. So he instructed the security service to follow Archie in all his movements. A week later on his desk was a full report on the unbridled appetites of Mandy, who also worked in the same firm. Experienced servicemen through her friends also got to know about the scam she had planned. They even knew that Archie had already accepted the terms of separation from his mistress. Even crossed himself mentally, Lord, let him go to all 4 sides. What marriage? What children? From all this only unnecessary troubles appear. The company decided to catch Archie red-handed at the moment of his meeting with the machine manufacturers. So the 2 sides hit it off. The reward envelope is already in Archie's hands. It's time for a different scenario. Considering that this was the first attempt of the employee to pocket the fee for the deal in order to purchase not the best quality equipment, the chief fired Archie without severance pay. A rumor was immediately started following the man unreliable specialists are not recommended to hire him. All of Emily's aspirations and endeavors went down the social garbage chute. How many lessons she once gave her boy, how many times before entering the technical university she took him to tutors in the city so that he could pass exams with high scores and enter the budget. The unified state exams were then introduced in the region as a trial experiment. Neither teachers nor students knew yet how this system would work. But he and Archie succeeded. How much later, in her student years, she fed, drank, clothed him? Would a young man be able to live on a paltry scholarship with his already then considerable demands? And it was their habit all summer to prepare supplies for the winter, to then solemnly hand the tasty gifts to their son. It had been 6 months now, and Emily still couldn't understand what had made Archie kick her out of the house in a blizzard. But she didn't want to find out what he was up to. She and her mother were still screwing jars of pickles and jam together this summer under long conversations, and they were still so fond of each other. They had no idea that Archie, long since separated from Maggie, was now living on casual labor. He was addicted to cheap hard liquor brought from unknown sources to the convenience store around the corner. His mother was unaware that now he would consider it a blessing to boil those homemade potatoes and snack on vodka with his mother's crunchy cucumber. Sometimes he had the impulse to go to the village and apologize, but his pride was not all drowned in the swamp of degrees. Here he will find a permanent job, he will rub everyone's nose in it, and then he will appear as a queen in his small homeland. The 30th anniversary of his graduation had been a very heartwarming occasion. Vincent didn't expect his classmates to follow his academic progress and be proud of him. The city of his childhood and youth had welcomed him very warmly in general. It hadn't changed much. Everything was native and familiar. After hearing about the tragic events in the family of his former neighbors in the stairwell, Vincent thought, I wish I knew how my life would have turned out if my father had not been assigned to that new surgical center in the Far East. Some annoying worm in his soul began to nudge him go to that village where you met your first love. No one is obliging you to anything, but don't you yourself want to put an end to that long ago story? Hiring an automobile, still a novelty in this region, he set off. This western manner had always been to his liking. He vaguely remembered the name of the village where he had once harvested watermelons and melons in the melons fields, but that didn't bother him at all. He remembered the approximate route. He got there quickly on the highway, but when he turned onto a dirt road, he grinned to himself, some things haven't changed a bit in more than 30 years. He was caught up by a UA's truck running on all sides, and Vincent, who had just stopped for a snack before it got dark, raised his hand to ask the driver to stop. Good people, good evening, he greeted the middle-aged man. Can you tell me how far it is to the village? I haven't been in your neighborhood for very many years. The owner of the Uazik looked around the foreigner curiously, at his appearance a gentleman in an expensive jacket and new jeans. Are you going to visit someone? Or so, driving around the neighborhood for idle curiosity, he asked. I'm looking for some people I know, Uncle Matthew and Aunt Ellen's family. They had a daughter, Emily. Vincent answered honestly, deciding not to be sarcastic. They do. The man nodded. Only the head of the family has been dead for about 7 years. The rest of them are alive and well. Vincent's breath caught in the excitement, and he could barely move his tongue. Emily and her husband are separated, aren't they? Family, kids. Emily has a son, the man replied. After hearing about the tragic events in the family of his former stairwell neighbors, Vincent thought, I wonder how my life would have turned out if my father hadn't been assigned to that new surgical center in the Far East. Some annoying worm in his soul began to nudge him go to that village where you met your first love. No one is obliging you to anything. But don't you yourself want to put an end to that long ago story? hiring an automobile. Still a novelty in this region, he set off. This western manner had always been to his liking. He vaguely remembered the name of the village where he had once harvested watermelons and melons in the melon fields, but that didn't bother him at all. He remembered the approximate route. He got there quickly on the highway, but when he turned onto a dirt road, he grinned to himself. Some things haven't changed a bit in more than 30 years. He was caught up by a UA's truck running on all sides, and Vincent, who had just stopped for a snack before it got dark, raised his hand to ask the driver to stop. "Good people. Good evening," he greeted the middle-aged man. "Can you tell me how far it is to the village? I haven't been in your neighborhood for very many years." The owner of the Uwazik looked around the foreigner curiously at his appearance, a gentleman in an expensive jacket and new jeans. "Are you going to visit someone? Or so, driving around the neighborhood for idle curiosity?" he asked. "I'm looking for some people I know, Uncle Matthew and Aunt Ellen's family. They had a daughter," Emily. Vincent answered honestly, deciding not to be sarcastic. "They do," the man nodded. "Only the head of the family has been dead for about 7 years. The others are alive and well. There's a big brat. I even took her to him to town last winter on New Year's Eve. She's never been married. She gave birth to a boy 30 years ago to a student, but he left her when she was pregnant. She's been alone ever since. I asked to see her, but she refused. But I'm a little more than that with you, Yuji," said the man. Greg looked suspiciously at the colorful man, jumped into his UAZ and drove off across the field. Vince stood in the middle of the road in complete confusion. Then, just as quickly, he climbed into the car, unable to wait any longer. Now he would find his first love, his first woman, and what would be will be. In the village, he found the old cottage of Ellen's family. No hesitation. It's dark. Behind the pattern of this curtain, a bright light burned in the hut. The muffled sound of a television could be heard from the open window. He walked from the gate to the porch on trembling legs, climbed the 3 steps and knocked on the door. Behind it came brisk footsteps and a woman's whisper. "Emily, look who it is. You've come to see us at night." Emily threw a warm shawl around her shoulders. She had just bathed her mother and was dressing her in clean clothes. She had just bathed her mother and was dressing her in clean clothes as she dressed her. She looked at the guest silently from head to toe and said a phrase that made Vince's heart sink. "I knew you'd come back." Every love story may or may not have a sequel. Some endings are like a fairy tale, as happened in this marvelous novel. Listening to the story of Vince and Emily's love story, there's so much irony. You'd think some writer was feeding us fables. It doesn't happen in real life. But it did happen. Emily's wise woman's heart did not set up a judgment on the actions of the man she loved. Sensible masculine heart of Vincent immediately prioritized with mathematical precision, scattered the answers to the tasks at hand. Neither of them knew where the girl's letters had disappeared to. Some evil force had played out for them this sad play of long separation, where they had the lead roles. Archie, who had been working as a loader in a regular store for the 2nd year, decided to go to a beer bar after his shift to relax a little. Lately, he had stopped with stronger drinks, as he began to ruin his liver. Had enough sense to tone it down a bit. The man at the far table seemed vaguely familiar to him. Grabbing a mug with a still foamy cap and a plate of dried shrimp, he headed over to keep him company. Greg. It was him, having settled all his business, stopping at the first bar he could find to grab a bite to eat. He didn't recognize Archie as the unkempt, bearded man who plumped himself on the stool opposite him. "Isn't there any other tables around?" he asked his uninvited neighbor with hostility. "Don't you recognize me, Uncle Greg?" "It's me, Archie. We're from the same village." It was only now that Greg realized that the drunken man looked remotely like Emily's son. Only lower and older, but still he was recognizable. "How's life with you?" My grandmother's still alive, and my mom's still working on her pickles. Archie tried to stretch his face into a wry smile, but his mood suddenly soured. Why did he even sit down with his fellow countrymen? It seemed that he had once been in love with his mother, and now he was going to start teaching him about life again. But Greg grinned good-naturedly and answered, "The whole village is praying for your mother. We have a new road with excellent asphalt. Her husband organized everything and paid the expenses. My grandmother was taken to the Far East, to a surgical center, and was treated a little. She hasn't become active, but she can move around quite well with a stick. And your parents have built such a nice house next to the old house. It's a sight to behold." Archie thought he'd misheard. Why did Uncle Greg say parents and not one mother? It was as if he'd overheard his thoughts. The countryman went on with his story. Archie's parents had a beautiful love story. 30 years later, they were reunited again. Everyone in the village used to think that such things only happened in books and movies. No, I witnessed for myself that a woman's love is strong, strong and faithful. She waited. This story warmed my soul, gave me hope that even at their age, happiness is still possible. Come on, brother, I still have to get home. Shall I say hello to your mother? Or would you deign to show up at their house yourself? I'll take care of it, Archie grumbled. His mood had fallen, along with his ego. The bus pulled away from the bus stop near the village. The driver looked back at the passenger compartment. There was only some vague-looking man getting out, moving his lips all the way, as if he were practicing a speech. Archie was really working hard to find the words he would say to his mother to apologize. But everything that came into his head seemed empty and insignificant. Love for one's family is in actions, not words. Could he earn forgiveness from his parents? The man crept quietly to the ajar gate and peered through the opening. Workers were laboring in the yard near the old house. A picturesque log house of 2 stories stood out next to the construction site. It immediately reminded Archie of some fairy tale log cabin where Santa Claus, forest gnomes, or some other magical characters could live. Everything around breathed coziness, some special domestic charm. His mother walked through the yard in an embrace with a gray-haired man. "Yes, it's going to be a great bath. Don't worry," Maggie the man said. "Ellen's mother will be back from her treatment soon. It'll be a nice surprise for her." He kissed the woman on the top of her head and hurried off to the workers to give them new orders. Emily returned to the gazebo, where the electric kettle was already boiling. A jar of Archie's favorite apricot jam and vases of cookies stood on the table. He pushed the wicket gently open and stepped forward, mentally vowing to himself that he would do everything he could to make his family forgive him and welcome him back into their home. If necessary, he would start his journey again from scratch, from the basics. He now knows exactly what things rule this world. Someday he will teach these truths to his children.